Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is David Mercer, and 6 months ago, I believed that maps were the most honest things in the world. Numbers don't lie. Coordinates are absolute. Longitude and latitude form a grid that contains all of reality within neat, manageable lines. I was a cartographer for Terramark Systems, a surveying company that specialized in creating high-resolution topographical maps for municipalities and private land developers. It was methodical work, the kind that required precision and patience, two qualities I'd always possessed in abundance. The job paid decently, the hours were predictable, and I spent most of my time alone with expensive equipment and the quiet certainty of measured space. I never imagined that certainty could become a weapon. I never imagined that the numbers themselves could lie. The Hillstead County project arrived on my desk in early April, during that stretch of spring when winter's last gasps still froze the morning dew, but the afternoons promised something warmer. My supervisor, Gerald Hatch, dropped the manila folder on my workstation with the kind of casual weight that suggested routine. Inside were preliminary satellite images, county property records, and a letter of intent from a development company called Meridian Holdings. They wanted a comprehensive topographical survey of a 600-acre parcel in the northwestern corner of the county, an area that current maps designated as mixed woodland and wetland. The plans called for a residential community, 200 homes, a small commercial center, the usual infrastructure. Standard work, the kind I'd completed dozens of times before. What distinguished this particular job was the timeline. Meridian Holdings wanted the survey completed within 3 weeks, an aggressive schedule that Gerald justified with a significant bonus structure. The county records indicated that the land had been in continuous private ownership since the early 19th century, passing through various family trusts and holding companies, most recently acquired by Meridian through a quiet sale that hadn't even made the local papers. The satellite imagery showed dense forest canopy with a few clearings, a network of what appeared to be old logging roads, and a small structure near the eastern boundary that the records identified as a historical building of uncertain purpose. The wetland areas followed what seemed to be a natural drainage pattern from higher elevation in the west toward a creek system in the east. I spent the first day in the office, correlating the satellite data with older survey maps from the county archives. This was standard procedure, establishing a baseline understanding before setting foot in the field. The earliest map I could find dated to 1847, a hand-drawn survey that showed the property as part of a larger tract owned by someone named Cornelius Vreeland. The cartography was crude by modern standards, but it showed the same basic topography, forested upland sloping toward wetland, with notations in elegant script describing suitable timber and marshy ground, unreliable. A second survey from 1923 showed property subdivisions and indicated that the eastern portion had been used for small-scale farming, though the notes mentioned persistent drainage issues and soil quality insufficient for sustained agriculture. What struck me as odd, though I didn't register it as significant at the time, was the absence of any surveys between 1923 and 2003. For 80 years, no one had apparently felt the need to formally measure this particular piece of land. The 2003 survey had been commissioned during a property boundary dispute and covered only the perimeter, providing no detail about the interior. When I overlaid the historical maps with current satellite imagery, the alignment was imperfect, not unusual given the crude measurement techniques of earlier eras, but something about the discrepancies nagged at me. The creek system appeared in slightly different locations across the various maps, as if the water itself had migrated over the decades. Waterways do change course, of course, especially in areas with soft soil and seasonal flooding, but the variations seemed more substantial than natural processes would suggest. I made notes about these inconsistencies, planning to verify them in the field. Part of my methodology involved using differential GPS equipment that could provide positional accuracy within centimeters, allowing me to establish ground control points that would serve as references for the entire survey. The plan was straightforward. Spend a week establishing the control network, another week collecting detailed topographical data, and a final few days processing and verifying the results. I'd be working alone for most of it, which suited me fine. Solitary field work had always been my preference. There's a meditative quality to the process, a rhythm of movement and measurement that empties the mind of everything except the immediate task. The drive to the property took 90 minutes, most of it along county roads that grew progressively narrower and less maintained as I traveled northwest. The land here was sparsely populated, a patchwork of small farms, second-growth forest and properties that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual abandonment. Mobile homes with tarped roofs sat in clearings surrounded by the rusted hulks of vehicles and farm equipment. Occasionally, I'd pass a more maintained property, a newer house, a barn in decent repair, but these became increasingly rare as I approached my destination. The last town of any size was a place called Brennan Falls, population 800 according to a weathered sign, though the empty storefronts along its main street suggested that number was optimistic. Beyond Brennan Falls, the road followed a ridgeline that offered occasional glimpses of the valley below, where morning fog still clung to the low areas, creating islands of treetops that appeared to float in white seas. The GPS indicated I was approaching the property boundary, and I slowed, looking for the access road that the county records had mentioned. I almost missed it, a gap in the tree line marked only by two rusted posts that might once have supported a gate. The track beyond was overgrown but passable, two parallel ruts separated by a grass median that scraped the undercarriage of my truck as I eased forward. The transition from county road to private property was immediate and unsettling. The forest here felt older, the trees larger and more densely packed, their branches creating a canopy that reduced the morning sunlight to a dim, green-filtered glow. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could smell the rich, mulchy scent of decomposition and damp earth. The track wound between massive oaks and maples, their trunks thick enough that three people linking hands couldn't have encircled them. Undergrowth pressed close on both sides, and I had to navigate carefully to avoid branches that reached out like arthritic fingers. After about a quarter mile, the track opened into a clearing perhaps 50 yards across. Someone had maintained this space at some point. The stumps visible through the grass suggested deliberate clearing rather than natural fall, but that maintenance had ceased long ago. Saplings and brambles were reclaiming the edges, and the grass itself grew in uneven patches interspersed with bare dirt and standing water. At the far side of the clearing, barely visible through a screen of young pines, I could see a structure. This would be the historical building indicated on the property records. I parked the truck at the clearing's edge and spent a moment studying the building through my windshield. It was larger than I'd expected. 2 stories of weathered clapboard with a steep pitched roof that spoke to an era when snow loads were a serious architectural consideration. The windows were intact but dark, reflecting the forest around them in ways that made it difficult to see if there was anything inside. A covered porch ran the length of the front facade, and I could see what might have been a door, though it was shadowed enough that I couldn't be certain. The building's style suggested late 19th century construction, utilitarian rather than decorative, built for function rather than beauty. Given its size and isolation, I guessed it might have been a hunting lodge or perhaps a foreman's residence for timber operations. The county records had mentioned the structure, but provided no details about its history or current condition. The property insurance documents in my file noted it only as existing improvement, historical nature, condition unknown. No one seemed particularly interested in it, which made sense given that Meridian's development plans showed it slated for demolition. I made a note to document it photographically and include its coordinates in my survey, but I had no intention of entering it. Old buildings in isolated locations tend to attract people who shouldn't be there: squatters, drug users, teenagers seeking thrills. And I'd learned early in my career that disturbing such occupants was both dangerous and unnecessary. I spent the next hour unloading equipment and setting up my base camp in the clearing. The differential GPS system required a stable base station that would remain in a fixed location throughout the survey, continuously logging data that I could later use to correct positional measurements from the rover unit I'd carry into the field. I chose a spot near the clearing center, away from the tree line where foliage might interfere with satellite signals, and drove a metal stake deep into the ground. The base station mounted on this stake, a sophisticated array of antennas and receivers enclosed in a weatherproof housing. Once activated, it would communicate with GPS satellites overhead, establishing a precise three-dimensional position that would serve as the reference point for everything else. The setup process was familiar, almost automatic. I performed these same tasks hundreds of times in hundreds of locations. Level the mount, secure the antenna, connect the cables, power up the system, wait for satellite lock, verify signal quality, begin logging. The equipment hummed softly, its LED indicators cycling through their startup sequence with mechanical precision. Green lights appeared one by one as the system established communication with satellites. 4, 6, 8, 12. Excellent signal strength. The display showed positional uncertainty decreasing as more data accumulated. 2 meters, 1 meter, 50 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 10. After 15 minutes, the system had achieved optimal accuracy, and I locked the base station into continuous logging mode. With the base established, I assembled the rover unit, a handheld GPS receiver connected to a survey-grade antenna mounted on a carbon fiber pole. This was the tool I'd carry throughout the property, collecting elevation data at precisely measured locations that would later form the topographical map. The rover communicated with the base station via radio link, allowing real-time differential correction that kept positional accuracy within 5 centimeters even in challenging terrain. I tested the link, verified that the rover was receiving corrections properly, and conducted a brief walk around the clearing to confirm system functionality. Everything operated exactly as it should. The numbers appeared on the small screen with mechanical certainty, describing my position in space with mathematical precision. I should have felt reassured by this precision. I should have trusted the numbers the way I always had. But standing there in that clearing, with the old building watching from behind its screen of pines and the forest pressing close on all sides, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years of field work: uncertainty. Not about my equipment or methodology, those were sound, but about the space itself. The clearing felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The light fell strangely, creating shadows that seemed too dark for the overcast morning. The air was too still, absent the subtle movements that even calm days possess. And the silence was absolute in a way that natural places never are. No birds called from the trees. No insects hummed through the grass. No wind rustled the leaves. Even my movement seemed muted, as if the clearing absorbed sound rather than allowing it to propagate naturally. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to isolation and the oppressive quality of the dense forest. I'd worked in remote locations before. The initial strangeness always faded once I settled into the routine of surveying. I returned to the truck, retrieved my field pack, containing water, lunch, first aid supplies, spare batteries, and various tools, and consulted the preliminary survey plan I'd developed in the office. The most efficient approach would be to establish a network of control points throughout the property, beginning with the perimeter and working inward. I'd planned 16 primary control points, each precisely positioned to provide complete coverage of the 600-acre parcel. The first point was to be located at the northwestern corner of the property, approximately half a mile from the clearing, following what the satellite imagery suggested was an old logging road. I oriented myself using the GPS, identified the likely route, and set off into the forest. The temperature dropped further once I left the clearing, and the quality of light changed from dim to genuinely dark, filtered through multiple layers of canopy until it arrived at ground level as a weak, colorless glow. The logging road, such as it was, existed more as a concept than a physical reality. I could identify where it had been by reading the forest: slightly larger gaps between trees, a subtle linear pattern in the undergrowth, occasional remnants of gravel that time and rain hadn't yet dispersed completely. Walking through that forest required constant attention. The ground was uneven, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves that concealed rocks, roots, and sudden depressions filled with standing water. I moved carefully, testing each step before committing my weight, keeping one eye on the GPS display and the other on the terrain ahead. The rover unit's antenna, mounted on its 6-foot pole and held vertically before me, occasionally snagged on low branches, forcing me to duck and weave through the understory. 30 minutes into the walk, I'd traveled perhaps a quarter mile. At this pace, establishing the control network would take longer than I'd estimated, but there was no way to move faster without risking injury or equipment damage. The forest revealed its age through accumulation. Massive fallen logs, themselves covered in moss and secondary growth, formed barriers that required careful navigation. Some had fallen so long ago that they'd begun to dissolve back into the soil, their wood soft enough that my boot punched through the outer shell to reveal the powder within. Others were more recent, their bark still intact, beetles and other insects visible in the exposed wood where branches had broken away. The standing trees were equally varied, ancient specimens 3 feet in diameter existing alongside younger growth, creating a multi-generational density that blocked sightlines beyond 20 or 30 feet. I reached what the GPS indicated was the northwestern property corner at approximately 11 in the morning. The location was marked by nothing visible, No survey monument or property marker that I could find despite spending 15 minutes searching through the undergrowth. This wasn't unusual. Old property corners often disappeared through time and neglect, and I'd come prepared to establish new reference points. I cleared a small area of leaves and debris, selected a spot with solid ground, and drove a steel stake deep into the earth. This would serve as one of my primary control points. I mounted the rover antenna directly over the stake, leveled it carefully using the built-in bubble, and initiated a 5-minute static observation that would establish the point's coordinates with maximum accuracy. While the GPS logged data, I surveyed the surrounding forest, noting terrain features and vegetation patterns that I'd later correlate with topographical measurements. The ground here sloped gently downward toward the north and west, exactly as the satellite imagery had suggested. Water had accumulated in low spots, creating small pools where the organic matter in the soil created a tea-colored darkness that made it impossible to judge depth. The trees in this area showed signs of stress: dead branches in the crowns, fungal growths on the trunks, sections of bark that had fallen away to reveal pale wood beneath. Not unusual in wetland transition zones, where trees adapted to drier conditions found themselves in increasingly saturated soil. The 5-minute observation completed, and I recorded the results in my field notebook: coordinates, elevation, time, observation duration, satellite configuration, positional uncertainty estimate. Then I photographed the stake from multiple angles, creating visual documentation that would supplement the numerical data. These photographs were part of the professional methodology I'd developed over years of work, concrete proof that I'd been where I claimed to be, that the control points existed in physical space rather than merely in digital files. I was preparing to move to the second control point when I noticed something that made me pause. On the GPS display, my current position was indicated by a blue dot surrounded by concentric circles representing positional uncertainty. The uncertainty shown was 5 centimeters, exactly what I'd expect given the excellent satellite configuration and the differential corrections from the base station. But when I checked the absolute coordinates, the actual numbers describing my position on the Earth's surface, something seemed off. I pulled out the printed satellite image from my pack and tried to orient myself on it, marking my supposed position with a pencil dot. According to the coordinates, I should have been about 40 feet west of where I actually stood. Not a large discrepancy, but noticeable. I rechecked the GPS display, verified that it was receiving corrections properly, confirmed that the base station was functioning. Everything indicated that the system was working perfectly, providing the 5-centimeter accuracy that the specifications promised. Yet when I looked at the satellite image and tried to correlate features, the pattern of large trees, the orientation of what I could see of the slope, the location of water accumulation, my physical position, and the GPS coordinates didn't quite align. I made a note of the discrepancy but didn't dwell on it. Satellite images can be misleading, especially under forest canopy, where the viewpoint is fundamentally different from ground level. And property boundaries in rural areas are often approximations. They're recorded coordinates based on decades-old surveys conducted with far less accurate equipment. The important thing was establishing a consistent network of control points using modern GPS technology. Whatever small errors existed in the historical record would be corrected by my work. The second control point was to be located along the western property boundary, roughly a quarter-mile south of where I currently stood. I set off through the forest, following the boundary line that existed only as coordinates in my GPS. The ground continued its gentle downward slope, and the soil became progressively wetter, my boots occasionally breaking through the leaf litter to sink inches into saturated earth. The standing water became more prevalent, transforming from occasional pools to a nearly continuous shallow covering that reflected the canopy above in fragmented mirror images. I had to pick my route carefully, testing the ground ahead with my survey pole to avoid hidden depths. This was the wetland area that the old survey notes had described as marshy ground, unreliable. The phrase seemed apt. There was something fundamentally uncertain about this landscape, as if the boundary between solid earth and open water was not a line, but rather a gradient, a transitional space where neither condition fully applied. The trees here had adapted to the flooding, developing root systems that spread horizontally rather than driving deep, creating tangles that rose above the water level like skeletal hands. Spanish moss hung from branches in gray curtains, and the air smelled of decomposition and sulfur, the chemical signature of anaerobic decay. I reached the location indicated for the second control point and encountered my first serious problem. According to the GPS, I stood at the correct coordinates, but the physical reality made establishing a control point impossible. The location fell in standing water perhaps 18 inches deep, far too deep to simply drive a stake and level the antenna over it. I could wade in an attempt to find bottom, but the water's opacity made it impossible to see what lay beneath, and I had no desire to test the depth with my legs. Moreover, even if I found solid ground, the entire area was clearly subject to seasonal fluctuation. A control point here would be useless if it ended up underwater for parts of the year. I made the decision to relocate the point, moving approximately 60 feet to the east where a slight rise created marginally drier ground. This wasn't ideal. Control networks function best when points are positioned exactly as planned, but field conditions often require adaptation. I drove the stake, conducted the static observation, and recorded the modified coordinates in my notebook, along with an explanation of why I deviated from the plan. The professional thing to do, the methodologically sound approach. Yet even as I worked, I felt a growing discomfort that had nothing to do with the wet conditions or the minor setback. The forest here felt different from the area around the first control point. Not just wetter, but somehow more wrong, though I struggled to identify what specifically had changed. The silence remained absolute, that same absence of natural sound that I'd noticed in the clearing. But here, the wrongness extended beyond mere silence into something more fundamental. The space felt compressed, as if the air pressure had increased, creating a subtle tension that made breathing require conscious effort. The light, already dim, seemed to have degraded further, taking on a quality I'd never encountered before. Not darker exactly, but somehow less present, as if the photons themselves were reluctant to fully arrive. I completed the observation, documented the point, and checked my watch. It was just past noon, which meant I'd been in the field for nearly 3 hours and had established only 2 of the 16 planned control points. At this pace, the survey would take far longer than 3 weeks. I'd need to increase efficiency, which meant accepting slightly less rigor in the observation times and moving more quickly between points. I wasn't comfortable with this compromise, but the schedule was non-negotiable, and Gerald had made it clear that the bonus structure depended on meeting the deadline. The third control point was located to the south, following the western boundary toward what should have been higher, drier ground. I set off, grateful to be moving away from the deepest wetland areas. The ground did rise gradually, and the standing water became less prevalent, though the soil remained saturated enough that each step released water that pooled in my footprints. The trees here were more varied, a mixture of species suggesting a transitional ecology between wetland and upland forest. I noted white oak, red maple hickory, and what I thought might be black cherry, though the light was too poor to make certain identification. As I walked, I found myself checking the GPS display more frequently than usual, compulsively verifying that I remained on course. The coordinates advanced in their predictable way, the numbers changing with mechanical precision as I moved through space. Latitude decreased, longitude changed minutely, elevation values fluctuated within a narrow range. Everything functioned exactly as it should. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something about these numbers was wrong, that they described a space that didn't quite correspond to the physical reality I inhabited. This feeling intensified when I reached the coordinates for the third control point. According to the GPS, I stood at the correct location, but when I tried to correlate my position with the satellite imagery, the discrepancy I'd noticed at the first point appeared again, and larger. The image showed what appeared to be a small clearing at these coordinates, perhaps 30 feet across, with a distinctive cluster of large trees at its eastern edge. I stood in dense forest with no clearing visible in any direction, and no cluster of trees matching the image pattern. I expanded my search, walking in widening circles around the indicated coordinates. 50 feet north, I found what might have been the clearing, a slightly more open area where undergrowth grew thicker than the surrounding forest, suggesting more available light. But the GPS insisted this location was 50 feet away from where the control point should be, and the cluster of trees the image showed was absent. I walked south, then east, then west, trying to find some correlation between the satellite view and ground reality. Nothing matched. Either the image was significantly incorrect, or I'd somehow miscalculated my position, or the GPS was providing coordinates that didn't correspond to physical space in the way I'd always understood. I stood in what I estimated to be the approximate center of the clearing that wasn't quite a clearing, and felt the first real stirring of something beyond mere discomfort. This was wrong in a way that my professional experience couldn't adequately explain. GPS systems don't malfunction like this. Differential corrections don't introduce 50-foot positional errors. Satellite images aren't this divergent from ground truth, especially in stable terrain that hadn't been subject to recent dramatic changes. Yet one of these elements had to be wrong, because they couldn't all be simultaneously accurate and produce the contradictions I was observing. I decided to establish the control point at the GPS-indicated coordinates despite the discrepancy with the imagery. The purpose of my survey was to create a new map, not to reconcile old data. If the satellite image was incorrect, which seemed the most likely explanation, my ground truth measurements would supersede it. I drove the stake, completed a 3-minute observation as a compromise between thoroughness and schedule pressure, and moved on to the fourth point. The pattern continued throughout the afternoon. Each control point location showed some degree of mismatch between GPS coordinates and physical reality, as suggested by the satellite imagery. Sometimes the discrepancy was minor, 10 or 15 feet, easily attributed to image resolution or georeferencing errors. Other times it was substantial enough that I had to search extensively to find any correlatable features. The forest itself remained consistently oppressive, silent, dark, and characterized by that strange quality of wrongness that I still couldn't adequately define, but that grew stronger with each passing hour. By 4 o'clock, I'd established 7 control points, less than half my planned total but acceptable progress given the difficult conditions. I was working in the southeastern portion of the property now, where the ground rose toward what the old maps called a wooded upland. The vegetation had changed again, the wetland species giving way to trees adapted to better drainage. Oak, ash, tulip poplar, with an understory of mountain laurel and various ferns. The change suggested improved soil conditions, and indeed my boots were no longer sinking into saturated earth with each step. The 7th control point established, I paused to eat lunch from my pack and consult the GPS display. According to the coordinates, I was approximately a quarter mile from the clearing where I'd parked my truck and established the base station. But the route back wouldn't be a simple straight line. The wetlands I'd traversed in the morning lay between my current position and base camp, and I had no desire to navigate those areas in failing light. Instead, I'd follow higher ground to the east, then swing north to approach the clearing from a drier direction. I set off, following the ridgeline east. The forest here was different again, the trees smaller and more densely packed, suggesting either younger growth or poorer soil conditions that limited development. The understory was thick with mountain laurel that reached above my waist, forcing me to push through or detour around particularly dense patches. Progress was slow, and I began to worry about being caught in the forest after dark. I had a headlamp in my pack, but navigating this terrain in darkness would be both slow and dangerous. That's when I saw the building. It appeared suddenly through a gap in the laurel, perhaps 80 feet ahead, its weathered clapboard visible between tree trunks. My first thought was that I'd somehow circled back to the clearing, that my navigation had been worse than I'd realized, and I'd wasted an hour walking in a loop. But as I pushed closer, I recognized that this wasn't the building I'd seen that morning. The structure was smaller, single-story, with a completely different roof line, and what appeared to be stone foundation walls rather than the wooden piers that supported the clearing structure. I consulted the GPS, verified my position, and confirmed what I'd suspected. I was nowhere near the clearing. According to the coordinates, I stood approximately 400 yards south and 200 yards east of my truck. This building wasn't on any of the maps I'd reviewed. The satellite imagery showed no structure at this location, just forest canopy. The county property records made no mention of any improvement except the single building near the clearing. Yet here it stood, undeniably physical, its boards gray with age and its windows dark rectangles that reflected nothing. I approached cautiously, my surveyor's instinct to document overcoming any unease about unexpected discoveries. The building was perhaps 30 feet square, single-story with a steeply pitched roof that suggested it predated modern building codes. The clapboard siding showed extensive weathering but no obvious structural failure. The windows, 4 visible from my approach angle, were intact, their glass so covered with decades of grime that it was impossible to see inside. No door was visible on the wall facing me, suggesting the entrance was on one of the other faces. I walked around the structure's perimeter, noting details and taking photographs. The building sat on stone foundation walls about 3 feet high, creating a crawlspace beneath the main floor. The stones were roughly cut but carefully fitted, the kind of masonry work that suggested skilled hands, and a time when labor was cheap but materials were precious. Wooden steps, partially collapsed, led up to a door on the southern wall. The door itself was solid wood, deeply weathered but still hanging on its hinges. No lock was visible, just an iron latch that had rusted into a single corroded mass. Something about the building's proportions seemed wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what. The windows were positioned oddly, not quite centered on the walls, and at heights that seemed arbitrary rather than designed for function or aesthetics. The roof peak was too high for the building's footprint, creating an internal space that would be oddly proportioned. And the orientation was strange. Rather than aligning with compass points or following the contours of the land, it sat at an angle that seemed random, as if whoever placed it had simply dropped it without regard for environmental factors. I checked my watch. 4:30. I had perhaps an hour of useful daylight remaining, maybe 90 minutes if I pushed it. The sensible thing was to document the building's location, take a few more photographs, and return to base camp before darkness made navigation dangerous. I could note the structure in my survey report as an unrecorded improvement, provide its coordinates, and let Meridian deal with it during their due diligence. This was the professional approach, the one my training and experience dictated. Instead, I found myself climbing the partial stairs and reaching for the door latch. I can't adequately explain this decision except to say that the building exerted a kind of gravity, a pull that had nothing to do with physical attraction but felt no less compelling. The space around it was wrong in the same way the entire property was wrong, but more concentrated, more intense, as if whatever caused the wrongness emanated from this structure. I needed to understand it. I needed to see what lay inside. The latch resisted my attempts to lift it, rusted so thoroughly that metal and oxide had become essentially indistinguishable. I pulled harder, feeling the mechanism shift minutely under pressure. Something inside cracked, the sound sharp in the absolute silence. The latch gave way suddenly, and I nearly fell backward down the stairs. I caught my balance, took a breath, and pushed the door. It swung inward with surprising ease, the hinges silent despite their apparent age. Beyond lay darkness so complete that my eyes couldn't penetrate it even after several seconds of adjustment. I pulled my headlamp from my pack, switched it on, and directed the beam through the doorway. The light seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected, creating a dim circle of visibility that extended perhaps 10 feet before fading into impenetrable black. What I could see showed a single room, empty except for what appeared to be a large table or workbench along one wall. The floor was bare wood, deeply stained in patterns that suggested decades of water infiltration. The walls were unfinished boards, and I could see daylight through gaps where the clapboard siding had separated. I stepped inside, sweeping the headlamp beam across the interior. The space was larger than the exterior suggested it should be, though I attributed this to the darkness and my inability to see the corners clearly. The ceiling was invisible above me, lost in shadow despite the pitched roof that should have created a definite upper boundary. The air smelled of wood rot and something else, something sharp and chemical that I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, exactly, but distinctly wrong, as if the atmosphere inside the building wasn't quite the same composition as the air outside. The table along the wall drew my attention. As I approached, the headlamp beam revealed that it wasn't a table at all, but rather a long bench with what appeared to be equipment mounted on it. Old equipment, the kind you might find in a 19th century workshop. Vices, clamps, measuring instruments of uncertain purpose. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, but but I could still discern shapes and mechanisms. One device particularly caught my eye, a brass framework holding multiple lenses in adjustable mounts, with calibrated dials for fine positioning. It looked like surveying equipment, though of a design I'd never encountered. I moved closer, examining the device without touching it. The brass had tarnished to a dark brown, but I could see fine engraving on various components, numbers, degree markings, manufacturer information too small to read clearly in the headlamp's beam. The lenses were remarkably intact, given the structure's apparent abandonment, protected perhaps by their mounting within the brass framework. When I shifted my position, the lenses caught the headlamp beam and reflected it back with unexpected intensity, creating multiple overlapping images of my light source that seemed to exist in slightly different positions. That's when I noticed the maps. They covered the walls, dozens of them, overlapping in layers that suggested obsessive documentation. I approached the nearest wall and examined the topmost layer. Hand-drawn on what appeared to be surveyor's plotting paper, the maps showed topographical features, contour lines, water courses, vegetation notations, but the scale was impossible to determine. Some details appeared microscopic, individual trees marked with precise positions, while others covered what must have been miles of terrain with broad strokes. And the contour lines themselves were wrong. They didn't flow smoothly from one elevation to another as topographical maps require. Instead, they intersected, merged, split apart, and sometimes simply stopped in the middle of the page without explanation. I carefully peeled back the top layer, revealing another map beneath. This one was even stranger, showing what appeared to be the same terrain but with completely different topography. A ridge that existed on the upper map was absent here. A valley shown in one appeared as elevated ground in the other. It was as if someone had mapped two different places but insisted they occupied the same coordinates. I peeled back another layer and another. Each map contradicted the ones above and below it, presenting alternative versions of the same space that couldn't all be accurate. The deeper I went in the layers, the older the maps appeared to be, their paper more brittle, their notations in ink rather than pencil. And the handwriting changed too, becoming more elaborate and formal, transitioning from what might have been mid-20th century notation to Victorian-era script. But regardless of age, all the maps shared one characteristic. They showed impossible topography, terrain that violated basic physical principles, geography that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. At the very bottom of the layers, pressed directly against the wooden wall boards, I found maps drawn in a style I recognized from my archival research. These were identical in technique to the 1847 survey I'd reviewed in the county records. The same elegant script, the same conventions for indicating elevation and vegetation, even the same style of border and title block. But while the 1847 county survey had shown simple, comprehensible terrain, these maps displayed the same impossible topography as the later versions. Ridges that intersected at impossible angles, water courses that flowed uphill, contour lines that formed closed loops but indicated continuously increasing elevation. And in the corner of each map, in that same elegant script, was a notation. Survey conducted by C. Vreeland, territorial cartographer. The same name from the county records. Cornelius Vreeland, who had owned this property in the 1840s, who had apparently been a surveyor himself, who had created maps of terrain that couldn't physically exist. I stood in that dark building, headlamp beam moving across impossible cartography, and felt understanding begin to crystallize in a way I desperately wanted to resist. The discrepancies I'd been encountering all day, the mismatches between GPS coordinates and physical space, the way features didn't align with satellite imagery, the sense that the forest itself was somehow wrong, weren't errors in my equipment or methodology. They weren't the result of outdated historical records or poor satellite georeferencing. The space itself was wrong. The terrain I was surveying didn't follow the rules that govern normal, three-dimensional space. And Cornelius Vreeland had discovered this fact more than a century and a half ago. I pulled out my own GPS unit and checked the coordinates displayed on its screen. Then I looked at the maps on the walls, trying to find anything that corresponded to my current position. The numbers the GPS provided should have placed me at a specific point in space, a location definable by latitude, longitude, and elevation. But when I tried to find that point on Vreeland's maps, I couldn't. Not because the maps didn't cover this area. They clearly did, showing the same general property boundaries I'd been surveying. But because the point the GPS described didn't exist in a consistent way across the different layers. On one map, my coordinates fell on high ground. On another, in a valley. On a third, the coordinates themselves seemed to occupy a space that the map simply couldn't represent, indicated only by a blank area surrounded by notations in Vreeland's script that I couldn't quite decipher in the headlamp's limited beam. I photographed the maps systematically, working from top to bottom, documenting each layer before carefully peeling it back to reveal the one beneath. The paper was brittle, and I had to work slowly to avoid tearing it. Some maps came away in fragments, their adhesive having degraded over the decades until only gravity held them to the wall. Others were more stubborn, requiring careful work with my pocket knife to separate them from the layers above and below. As I worked, I became aware that the light outside was fading. Through the gaps in the clapboard, what had been dim forest twilight was darkening toward true night. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed that wasn't consumed by the need to understand what I was seeing told me to get out of that building and return to base camp, while navigation was still possible. But I kept working, peeling back maps, taking photographs, trying to find some pattern or logic in the impossible topography. The maps went deeper than I'd initially realized. What I'd thought was a few dozen layers turned out to be hundreds, perhaps thousands, each sheet thin as tissue, accumulated over what must have been decades of obsessive documentation. The deepest layers showed terrain that barely resembled the property I'd been surveying. The same boundaries existed. I could identify the property lines by their distinctive angles and the notations marking corner coordinates, but the interior space bore no relation to physical reality. Elevation contours formed impossible spirals. Watercourses branched and rejoined in patterns that suggested not geography, but rather some kind of notation system, a language of lines that described relationships I couldn't comprehend. And throughout these deeper maps, Vreeland's notations became increasingly cryptic, transitioning from straightforward surveying terminology to phrases that seemed more philosophical or mathematical than cartographic. One phrase appeared repeatedly in the margins. The land remembers what it was, not what it is. Another, written in a shakier hand that suggested advancing age or deteriorating mental state. Measurement changes the measured. Observation collapses possibility. And on the very deepest map I could reach, pressed so firmly against the wall that I couldn't remove it without destroying it, A single line written in letters large enough to be read even in the headlamp's dim beam. Do not trust the numbers. They lie to make themselves true. I stood there, hand resting on that final map, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity what Vreeland had discovered. The act of surveying, of imposing measurement on unmeasured space, didn't simply describe the land. It changed it. The coordinates themselves, the grid of latitude and longitude that we overlay on the world, weren't merely descriptive but prescriptive. They told the land what shape it should be, and the land, over time, complied, but imperfectly. The compliance was never complete, never quite right, leaving behind distortions and impossibilities that only someone who looked closely enough could detect. And Vreeland had looked very closely indeed. He'd spent years, perhaps decades, surveying this property over and over, documenting the changes, watching as the land shifted between states in response to measurement. The impossible topography in his maps wasn't error or madness. It was documentation of a space that existed in multiple configurations simultaneously, that couldn't be pinned down by coordinates because coordinates themselves were the problem, the cage that created its own distortions. My GPS unit, still clutched in my hand, suddenly felt like a weapon. Every measurement I'd taken that day had been an act of violence against this space, forcing it into conformity with a grid that didn't accommodate its actual nature. The control points I'd established weren't reference markers. They were anchors, pinning the land down, making it submit to the tyranny of coordinates. And the more points I established, the more completely I surveyed this property, the more thoroughly I would destroy whatever strange quality it possessed. I thought about Meridian Holdings and their planned development. 200 homes, commercial space, roads and utilities, and all the infrastructure of human habitation. A development like that required extensive surveying, not just the topographical work I was doing, but boundary surveys, utility surveys, construction staking. Thousands of measurements, tens of thousands, each one telling the land what shape it should be, what configuration of space was acceptable. By the time construction completed, the property would be so thoroughly measured, so completely described by coordinates, that whatever Vreeland had discovered here would be erased entirely. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Meridian knew exactly what this property was and wanted it destroyed. Or perhaps they had no idea, and I was about to hand them the means to accidentally erase something that had persisted for centuries, maybe longer. Something that existed in the gaps between measurements, in the spaces coordinates couldn't quite contain. I checked my watch. 5:30. The light outside had degraded to the point where navigation would be genuinely dangerous. I needed to return to camp, but I'd lost track of my route during the obsessive documentation of maps. The GPS could guide me back. It could always guide me back, providing turn-by-turn directions with mechanical certainty. But after everything I just realized, the thought of trusting those coordinates filled me with deep unease. The GPS would tell me where I was and where I needed to go, but would it be telling me the truth? Or would it be telling me where I should be according to the grid, forcing me to follow a path that existed only in the abstract space of coordinates? I made my decision. I powered off the GPS, deliberately choosing to reject the grid's guidance. I'd navigate by dead reckoning and natural landmarks, the way surveyors had done before satellites and electronic equipment. It would be slower, less certain, but at least I'd be responding to the physical reality of the land rather than to numbers that might or might not correspond to actual space. I left the building, carefully closing the door behind me, though I couldn't quite articulate why that seemed important. The forest outside had transformed into a landscape of shadows and deeper shadows, the last remnants of daylight creating a dim glow that illuminated nothing clearly. I oriented myself as best I could, identifying the direction I believed was north based on the slope of the land and the patterns of moss on tree trunks. The clearing where I'd parked should be northeast of my current position, perhaps half a mile distant. In daylight, on good terrain, that would be a 15-minute walk. In darkness, through dense forest, it might take an hour or more. I switched on my headlamp and set off. The beam created a tunnel of visibility perhaps 20 feet deep, with the forest beyond remaining impenetrably dark. I moved slowly, testing each step, trying to maintain a consistent direction despite the obstacles that forced constant detours. The mountain laurel was particularly difficult in darkness, its dense branches catching at my pack and survey pole, requiring me to push through or backtrack and find alternative routes. After 20 minutes, I realized I was lost. Not dramatically lost. I knew my general direction and had confidence I'd eventually find the clearing if I kept moving northeast, but thoroughly enough that I had no clear sense of my exact position. The forest in darkness all looked identical, an endless repetition of tree trunks and undergrowth that provided no distinctive landmarks. I'd passed what I thought was the same fallen log 3 times, though it might have been 3 different logs that happened to be similar. The ground had remained level or gently sloping, which suggested I was still on the upland rather than descending into the wetlands, but beyond that I had no certainty. I paused to consider my options. I could power on the GPS, get precise coordinates, and navigate directly to camp. It would take 10 minutes, maybe less. The coordinates would guide me with absolute certainty, eliminating all guesswork and anxiety. But using the GPS meant accepting the grid, trusting the numbers, participating in the system that Vreeland had spent his life documenting, and that I'd spent the afternoon beginning to understand. It meant acknowledging that coordinates were more real than the land itself, that mathematical abstractions took precedence over physical experience. I kept the GPS powered off and continued northeast. The darkness deepened until the headlamp beam seemed to create more shadow than it eliminated, its harsh white light rendering the forest into a stark composition of extreme contrast that was harder to navigate than simple darkness might have been. Twice, I walked into low-hanging branches that I'd sworn weren't there seconds before. Once I stepped into a depression filled with water that appeared to be solid ground, until my boot broke through the leaf layer. The water was shockingly cold and deeper than I'd expected, rising above my ankle before my foot found bottom. I extracted myself, now with one boot full of frigid water, and reassessed. I'd been walking for perhaps 40 minutes, which should have brought me to the clearing or at least close enough to see the reflected glow of the base station's LED indicators. Instead, I remained surrounded by identical forest, with no hint of the open space I sought. Either my navigation was worse than I'd realized, or the distance was greater than I'd calculated, or something else was happening that I didn't want to acknowledge. That's when I saw the light, not the reflected glow of my own headlamp, but a different light, warmer and steadier, visible through the trees perhaps 100 yards to my left. My first thought was that I'd somehow circled around and was seeing the base station from an unexpected angle. But the light was wrong, too warm, too steady, moving in a way that LED indicators didn't move. It looked more like firelight, flickering and dancing as flames do, though who would be maintaining a fire in this forest at this hour made no sense. I adjusted my course, moving toward the light, As I approached, details resolved. The light came from a building. The building, I realized with a jolt of disorientation that was almost physical in its intensity. The same structure I'd explored earlier, or one identical to it, its windows now glowing with interior illumination that cast rectangles of warm light onto the surrounding forest. But that was impossible. I'd been walking northeast, away from where the building stood. I'd maintained that direction consistently, checking my heading against the slope and other natural indicators. I couldn't have circled back, unless the building had moved, or unless there were multiple identical buildings scattered through this property, which seemed even more impossible, or unless my understanding of direction and distance had been completely wrong, my natural navigation skills rendered useless by something about this space that made normal orientation impossible. I approached the building cautiously, the absurdity of the situation warring with the practical need to understand what was happening. The light from the windows was definitely firelight. I could see the characteristic flicker and dance of flames, could smell wood smoke that grew stronger as I drew near. Someone was inside, maintaining a fire, which meant the building wasn't as abandoned as it had appeared. I circled around to the door, the same door I'd entered earlier, and found it standing open. Light spilled out, creating a trapezoid of illumination on the ground that seemed unnaturally bright after the forest's darkness. I climbed the partial stairs, noting that they seemed more intact than they had been earlier, fewer broken boards, less obvious decay, and looked inside. The interior had transformed. Where before there had been darkness and emptiness, now a fire burned in a hearth I hadn't seen during my earlier exploration. The flames illuminated a room that was larger and more finished than I remembered, with plastered walls instead of bare boards, with furniture that included not just the workbench but also a desk, chairs, cabinets. And at the desk, writing by the light of an oil lamp that supplemented the firelight, sat a figure I knew instantly must be Cornelius Vreeland. He looked up as I appeared in the doorway, and I saw a face that belonged to 19th century daguerreotypes, bearded, stern, with eyes that held the kind of intensity that comes from years of sustained focus on a single obsessive question. He didn't seem surprised by my appearance. Instead, he set down his pen, blotted the paper he'd been writing on, and regarded me with an expression that mixed weariness with something that might have been relief. "You found it," he said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place, words shaped by a mouth accustomed to more formal speech patterns than modern conversation employs. The wrongness, the space that doesn't conform. I wondered how long it would take. I stood in the doorway, unable to speak, unable to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress and the isolation of the day's work. But the vision was too detailed, too consistent, too real in ways that hallucinations aren't. The heat from the fire reached me, warming my face. The smell of wood smoke and lamp oil filled my nostrils. When Vreeland moved, his chair creaked with the authentic sound of old wood under weight. "You're not real," I finally managed to say, the words inadequate but the only response I could formulate. "Reality is a question of measurement," Vreeland replied, his tone suggesting he'd had this conversation before, perhaps with himself. "I am as real as the coordinates that describe my position. The question is whether those coordinates correspond to your present, or whether they describe a different temporal state that happens to occupy the same spatial location." He stood, moving to the fire and using an iron poker to adjust the burning logs. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the plastered walls. "I've been surveying this property for 37 years, he continued, speaking to the fire rather than to me, trying to understand why the measurements never remain constant, why each survey contradicts the previous one, why the land seems to shift and change in response to observation." "The maps," I said, finding my voice. "On the walls, I saw them." "Attempts at documentation," Vreeland confirmed. "Each one captures a different state of the property. Some show the land as it was, others show it as it is. Still others show what it might become, depending on how thoroughly it's measured and described. The land exists in superposition, holding multiple configurations simultaneously until observation collapses it into a specific state. But the collapse is never complete. Remnants of the other states persist, creating the discrepancies you've been encountering." He turned to face me fully, and I saw in his eyes the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from years of wrestling with questions that have no answers. "I thought I could map it completely," he said. "I thought if I surveyed it thoroughly enough, established enough control points, took enough measurements, I could force it into a single stable state. But the opposite occurred. The more I measured, the more states it accessed. The more coordinates I imposed, the more ways it found to violate them. I created the problem I was trying to solve." "What is this place?" I asked. "Why does it behave this way?" Vreeland shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Perhaps it's a natural phenomenon, a location where the normal relationship between space and measurement breaks down. Perhaps it's something that was made, deliberately or accidentally, by some previous attempt to impose order on wilderness. Or perhaps all land is like this, and we only notice it when we look closely enough, when we try to pin it down with coordinates and discover that the pinning itself creates the instability." He returned to his desk, picked up the paper he'd been writing on, and offered it to me. I stepped into the room, crossing the threshold that separated impossible from merely improbable, and took the document. It was a map, of course, drawn in Vreeland's elegant style. But unlike the maps on the walls, this one showed no terrain features, no topography, no indication of elevation or vegetation. Instead, it was covered in mathematical notation, equations and formulas that I recognized as related to coordinate systems and geometric transformations, but which had been extended and elaborated into forms I'd never encountered. "My attempt at a solution," Vreeland explained. "A coordinate system that accommodates instability rather than denying it. Equations that describe space as probabilistic rather than deterministic. If we accept that locations can exist in multiple states simultaneously, then we need mathematics that can handle that multiplicity. Traditional surveying assumes space is fixed and measurement is merely documentation. This," he gestured to the formula-covered map, "assumes space is fluid and measurement is an active intervention that must account for its own effects." I studied the equations, recognizing elements from differential geometry and topology, seeing what might have been precursors to quantum mechanics decades before that field would be formalized. Vreeland had been working toward a theory that wouldn't be developed elsewhere until the 20th century, and he'd been doing it in isolation, driven by practical necessity rather than theoretical interest. "Did it work?" I asked. "Can you map this property using these equations?" "I don't know," Vreeland admitted. "I never had the opportunity to test it fully. I died here, you see, in this building on a November evening in 1884, collapsed at that desk, pen still in hand, probably from the heart condition I'd been ignoring for years. My maps and notes were discovered months later when distant relatives finally arranged to check on me. They understood nothing of the work, seeing only evidence of encroaching madness. The maps were left in place, the building sealed. And here they've remained, documenting what no one wants to acknowledge. Then I couldn't complete the sentence, couldn't voice the obvious conclusion. A ghost, a memory, a temporal echo, Vreeland shrugged. Choose the terminology that makes you comfortable. I'm a persistent phenomenon associated with this location, manifesting to those who are capable of perceiving the property's true nature. You qualified the moment you noticed the discrepancies in your measurements. The space recognized you as someone who might understand, and so it allows you to see me, to access this moment that technically ended 141 years ago. He moved to the window, looking out at darkness that I realized with a shock might not be the same darkness I'd been navigating. Others have come, he continued. Other surveyors over the years. Most never notice the wrongness or dismiss it as equipment error or find ways to rationalize the discrepancies. Their surveys force the land into temporary conformity, suppressing its nature for a time. But the suppression never lasts. Eventually, the property reverts, resuming its multiple states, waiting for someone who will see what it actually is. What should I do? I asked. The question felt absurd even as I voiced it, seeking advice from a dead man about how to handle a surveying project that involved terrain that violated physical law. But Vreeland was the only person who'd faced this situation before, the only one who might offer guidance. That depends on what you want, Vreeland replied. You could complete your survey using traditional methods, imposing coordinates that force the land into compliance. The development would proceed, 200 homes built on terrain that had been measured into submission. The wrongness would be buried under concrete and asphalt, hidden but not eliminated. Future residents might notice small oddities, distances that seem variable, areas where GPS doesn't work quite right, places where people feel consistently disoriented. But nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained away. He turned from the window to face me again. Or you could refuse to complete the survey. You could document what you've discovered and provide that documentation to your client, explaining that the property is unsuitable for development due to anomalous spatial characteristics. They would think you mad, of course. Your professional reputation would suffer, but the land would remain unmeasured, free to continue existing in its multiple states. Those can't be the only options, I said. There's a third, Vreeland acknowledged. You could attempt to complete the survey using my equations rather than traditional coordinates. Map the property in a way that accommodates its nature rather than suppressing it. Such a map would be useless for development. No engineer could design infrastructure based on probabilistic coordinates. But it would be true in a way that traditional maps can never be. It would describe what actually exists here rather than what we pretend exists. He returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed a leather-bound journal that looked identical to the field notebooks I carried. I've spent 141 years refining these equations, working in the spaces between moments, calculating in the gaps where measurement hasn't yet collapsed possibility. This contains everything I've learned, all the mathematics you'd need to survey this property accurately. I'm offering it to you if you want it. I stared at the journal, understanding that accepting it would mean committing to a course of action that would likely end my career. Traditional cartography had no room for the mathematics Vreeland had developed. If I attempted to use his methods, produced a survey based on equations that acknowledged spatial uncertainty, I'd be dismissed as incompetent at best, insane at worst. Gerald would fire me. Meridian would sue for breach of contract. My professional credentials would be questioned. Everything I'd built over years of careful, methodical work would collapse. But I'd spent the day discovering that everything I thought I understood about measurement and space was incomplete. Coordinates weren't neutral descriptors. They were tools of control, weapons that forced reality into conformity with abstract mathematical ideals. Traditional surveying wasn't documentation, it was colonization, the imposition of order on spaces that might have their own intrinsic order that we simply couldn't perceive. Every survey I'd ever completed had been an act of violence, however unintentional, against the land I'd thought I was merely describing. "If I take it," I said slowly, "if I use your methods, what happens to this place? To the building, the maps, to you?" "I don't know," Vreeland admitted. "Perhaps having my work continued will allow me to rest. Perhaps I'll persist, tied to this location until someone finally understands it completely. Or perhaps accurate measurement will dissolve me along with the multiple states I occupy. I've existed in uncertainty for so long that I've forgotten what resolution feels like." I reached out and took the journal. The leather was cool under my fingers, worn smooth by decades of handling. When I opened it, I saw page after page of dense mathematical notation, equations and derivations that would take months to fully understand. At the top of the first page, in Vreeland's elegant script, was a dedication to whoever comes after me, seeking truth rather than convenience. The moment I took the journal, the room began to fade. Not dramatically, not with the sudden dissolve of a dream, but gradually, as if someone were slowly reducing the illumination. The fire dimmed. The walls grew less distinct. Vreeland himself became translucent, his form visible but increasingly insubstantial. He smiled slightly, the first expression of anything like contentment I'd seen on his severe features. "Thank you," he said, his voice already distant, "for seeing, for understanding, for being willing to." The rest of his words were lost as the building completed its transition from solid to absent. I found myself standing in darkness, my headlamp the only illumination, surrounded by forest that pressed close on all sides. The structure was gone. No walls, no fire, no furniture. Just empty space where a building had been, or had seemed to be, or had existed in some state that wasn't quite either. But the journal remained in my hands, solid and undeniably real. I tucked it carefully into my field pack, zipping the compartment closed, and checked my watch. 6:15. I'd lost nearly an hour to the encounter with Vreeland, though the experience had felt both longer and shorter than that. And I was still lost in the forest, still needing to find my way back to camp, still facing the practical problem of navigation without GPS. I chose a direction that felt like northeast and started walking. The darkness was complete now, true night having fallen while I was, wherever I'd been. The headlamp beam showed me only the immediate obstacles, trees, undergrowth, uneven ground. Beyond that circle of visibility existed only darkness, and the knowledge that I was somewhere in 600 acres of forest that didn't follow normal spatial rules. I walked for what might have been 20 minutes or an hour. My sense of time had become unreliable when I heard water. Not the quiet presence of standing water in low areas, but the active sound of moving water, a creek or stream flowing over obstacles. The sound came from my left, and I adjusted my course toward it. Water meant drainage, and drainage meant I could follow it downhill until I reached the wetlands at the property's perimeter. From there, I could navigate around to the higher ground, where I'd established my base camp. The creek revealed itself gradually, the ground becoming progressively wetter, my boots splashing through shallow puddles before I reached actual flowing water. The stream was perhaps 6 feet wide, running fast enough that I could hear individual water sounds, the gurgle over rocks, the splash where it dropped over small falls, the quieter flow through deeper pools. I turned downstream and followed it, relieved to have a definite guide even if it wasn't taking me directly toward camp. After following the creek for perhaps 10 minutes, I realized something was wrong. The water was flowing uphill. Not dramatically. The slope was gentle enough that it wasn't immediately obvious, but definitely uphill, moving from lower elevation toward higher ground. I stopped, checked the slope by feel and by watching how water pooled around my boots, and confirmed what my senses were telling me. The creek was violating basic hydraulics, flowing counter to gravity in a way that simply couldn't happen in normal space. I thought about Vreeland's maps, the impossible topography they documented, the contour lines that intersected and looped in ways that three-dimensional space shouldn't allow. I was experiencing directly what he'd spent years trying to capture in his cartography. The land here didn't follow normal rules. Water could flow uphill if the underlying geometry permitted it. And without GPS coordinates to force the space into conventional configuration, I was perceiving it as it actually existed rather than as measurement insisted it should be. I continued following the creek despite its impossible flow, reasoning that even if it violated physics, it was still a linear feature that would eventually lead somewhere. The forest around me remained dark and silent, the headlamp beam creating its tunnel of limited visibility. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath in the light. My wet boot had gone from uncomfortably cold to numb, and I knew I'd need to deal with that soon or risk frostbite. The creek led me to a clearing, not the clearing where I'd parked, but a different space perhaps 40 feet across, centered on a depression that collected the creek's water before apparently allowing it to drain into the ground. As I stepped into this clearing, I felt a sudden shift, a sensation like stepping through an invisible membrane. The pressure in my ears changed. The quality of sound altered, becoming sharper, more present. And when I looked at my surroundings, I saw that the forest had changed. The trees were different, still the same species, but younger, smaller, less densely packed. The understory had different character, dominated by different plants. Even the soil looked different under my headlamp, darker and more organic. It was as if I'd moved not just spatially but temporally, stepping from the present-day forest into an earlier version of the same space. I checked my watch and saw that it had stopped, the digital display frozen at 6:15. I tapped it, shook my wrist, pressed buttons. Nothing. The device was completely dead despite having a fresh battery. I pulled out my cell phone, which I'd kept powered off to conserve battery, and attempted to turn it on. The screen remained dark. The phone was as dead as the watch, both rendered non-functional by whatever boundary I just crossed. I stood in the clearing, taking inventory of what still worked. My headlamp functioned, its LED beam unchanged. The mechanical compass on my pack strap still showed directions, though whether those directions corresponded to actual cardinal points was uncertain. And I had Vreeland's journal, its pages filled with mathematics that might explain what I was experiencing if I could understand them. Everything else, all the electronic equipment I relied on for surveying, was useless in this space. That's when I saw the stakes, wooden survey stakes, driven into the ground at precise intervals around the clearing's perimeter. They were weathered but still standing, each marked with notations carved directly into the wood. I approached the nearest one, directing my headlamp beam at the markings. The notation was in Vreeland's handwriting, or something very similar, showing coordinates and elevation in a format I recognized from 19th century survey records. But the numbers themselves were strange, including not just the normal 3 dimensions of latitude, longitude, and elevation, but additional values whose meaning I couldn't immediately discern. I pulled Vreeland's journal from my pack and opened it to the first page, studying the equations by headlamp. The mathematics were dense and would require serious study to fully understand, but certain patterns were apparent even on first inspection. Vreeland had developed a coordinate system that included additional dimensions beyond the traditional 3. Time was 1, explicit notation of when a measurement was taken, treated as equally important to where. But there were others, represented by Greek letters I didn't recognize, describing aspects of space that conventional surveying didn't acknowledge. I consulted the journal's index, finding an entry titled Practical Application of Extended Coordinates. The relevant pages showed field techniques for establishing control points using Vreeland's system. It required measurements that went beyond simple position. He'd noted magnetic field strength, barometric pressure, temperature, even more subjective qualities like apparent luminosity and subjective density of time. The idea was that accurate position required capturing all these parameters, not just the 3 spatial coordinates that conventional surveying measured. Using my headlamp and what instruments I still possessed that functioned mechanically rather than electronically, I attempted to replicate Vreeland's measurements at the nearest stake. I recorded the time, or rather, the time my now stopped watch showed when I entered this space. I measured air temperature using the simple mercury thermometer I carried for equipment calibration. I noted the magnetic bearing shown on my compass, and I attempted to quantify the more subjective parameters Vreeland listed, though I had no idea if my assessments meant anything. When I compared my measurements to the notations carved on the stake, I found approximate agreement. Not perfect. My instruments were crude and my technique uncertain, but close enough to suggest that Vreeland's control point described the same location I occupied. The stake marked not just a position in conventional space, but a specific state of the property, a particular configuration that existed at certain times or under certain conditions. And if I was reading the notations correctly, there were 16 more stakes scattered through the property, each marking a different state, each describing coordinates that were simultaneously identical and different. The same physical location, described in ways that acknowledged it could exist in multiple configurations. This was what Vreeland had been trying to accomplish, not forcing the land into a single state, but mapping all the states it could occupy. I spent the next hour searching the clearing's perimeter for additional stakes, documenting each one I found and recording its coordinates according to Vreeland's system. I located 7 stakes in total, arranged in what might have been a grid pattern if the underlying space were conventional, but which formed a more complex geometric figure when I plotted them on paper. The figure was 3-dimensional, or perhaps higher dimensional with projection into 3 dimensions, creating the pattern I could perceive. As I worked, I became aware that the clearing itself was changing, not dramatically or suddenly, but in subtle ways that accumulated over the course of my observations. The depression at the center seemed to grow slightly deeper. The trees at the clearing's edge appeared to shift position, moving inches over minutes in a drift so slow that I could only detect it by comparing their positions to the stakes I documented. The temperature fluctuated without apparent cause, warming and cooling in cycles that didn't correspond to any external factor I could identify. The clearing was transitioning between states, and my presence, my act of measuring and observing, was influencing which state it occupied at any given moment. This was the phenomenon Vreeland had spent his life studying, the reason his maps showed impossible topography. The land existed in superposition, accessing multiple configurations, and observation collapsed it temporarily into specific states. But the collapse was imperfect and impermanent. As soon as measurement ceased, the property returned to superposition, holding all possible configurations simultaneously. I realized with sudden clarity what completing my survey would do. Every control point I established, every measurement I took, every coordinate I imposed would force the land into increasingly rigid conformity with conventional space. The GPS base station I'd set up was even now broadcasting corrections that told the property what shape it should be. That insisted space conformed to the grid of latitude and longitude. If I continued my survey as planned, completing the network of control points and creating a detailed topographical map, I would successfully suppress the property's nature. The development could proceed on land that had been measured into submission. And Meridian's construction would complete the process. 200 homes, each positioned at exact coordinates, each foundation poured according to measurements that insisted space was fixed and deterministic. Roads laid out on surveyed center lines. Utility lines placed in trenches dug to specified depths and locations. The accumulated weight of all that measurement would crush the property's superposition, forcing it permanently into conventional configuration. The wrongness would be buried so deeply that it might never surface again. I sat on the ground near one of Vreeland's stakes and opened his journal to a section titled Ethical Considerations. His handwriting here was less steady than in the technical portions, suggesting he'd written this later in life, when the implications of his work had become clear. The surveyor, he'd written, must ask whether measurement serves the land or serves those who would exploit it. Traditional cartography facilitates extraction and development, transforming mystery into commodity, replacing what is with what is useful. I propose an alternative, surveying that documents without destroying, that maps while preserving the thing being mapped. This requires accepting that complete knowledge is impossible, that accurate description must include acknowledgement of uncertainty. He'd continued, the property I have studied for these many years exists in a state that conventional thought considers impossible. But impossibility is merely the label we apply to phenomena that don't conform to our expectations. A more honest approach acknowledges that our expectations may be wrong, that the land may possess qualities we have not yet developed the mathematics to describe. My equations are an attempt at such description, though I doubt they are complete. Whoever continues this work must be prepared to accept that completion may not be possible, that some spaces must remain partially unknown if they are to remain themselves. I closed the journal and sat in the strange clearing, listening to the impossible creek flow uphill, watching the trees drift imperceptibly into new positions, feeling the temperature fluctuate around me. Vreeland was asking me to choose between professional success and intellectual honesty, between the career I'd built and the truth I'd discovered. If I completed the survey using conventional methods, I'd meet my deadline, collect my bonus, maintain my reputation. The development would proceed, and I'd never think about this property again. But I'd spend the rest of my life knowing that I'd participated in the destruction of something unique, that I'd used my skills to erase a phenomenon I couldn't explain but had nevertheless witnessed. I'd have been complicit in the kind of violence that surveying regularly commits, forcing land into conformity with human expectations, suppressing anything that doesn't fit the grid. I made my decision. I would complete a survey, but not the one Meridian wanted. I would document the property using Vreeland's methods, creating maps that acknowledged its multiple states, that described its nature rather than prescribing what it should be. The resulting documentation would be useless for development, but would be true in ways that conventional surveys couldn't achieve. And yes, it would probably end my career. But some things were worth preserving, even at personal cost. The moment I committed to this course, I felt another shift, that same membrane sensation I'd experienced entering the clearing. The forest around me solidified somehow, became more present, more real. The quality of light changed even though my headlamp remained the same, as if the space itself had adjusted in response to my decision. And when I looked at my watch, I found it working again, the display showing 7:43. Nearly an hour and a half had passed while the watch was stopped, time that had accumulated somewhere outside conventional temporal flow. I stood, gathered my equipment, and consulted Vreeland's journal for guidance on how to proceed. The section on field methodology was detailed, showing how to establish control points that accommodated spatial uncertainty rather than suppressing it. The process was more complex than conventional surveying, requiring multiple observations at each location under varying conditions, documenting not just position, but all the parameters that seemed to influence which state the property occupied at any given moment. I'd need equipment I didn't currently possess, instruments for measuring magnetic field strength with precision, barometers accurate enough to detect subtle pressure changes, possibly even devices that hadn't been invented when Vreeland was alive. But I could begin with what I had, establishing a baseline using the mechanical tools that still functioned in this space. The GPS equipment was useless here, would remain useless until I returned to areas where conventional coordinates still applied. That was fine. Vreeland had conducted his surveys without satellites or electronic instruments. I could do the same. I spent another hour in the clearing, documenting it thoroughly using Vreeland's methodology. I took compass bearings to distinctive features, measured distances using a tape measure, recorded temperature and time and my subjective sense of the space's qualities. I sketched the clearing's layout, noting the positions of the survey stakes and the geometric figure they formed. And I attempted to describe in words the sensation of being here, the feeling of existing in space that held multiple configurations simultaneously. When I finally left the clearing, following what my compass insisted was north, I found that the forest had changed again. The trees were the right age now, contemporary rather than historical, but their position seemed subtly different from what I remembered. Small landmarks I'd noted earlier, a distinctively shaped boulder, a dead tree with particular branch structure, appeared in wrong locations, displaced by distances that ranged from a few feet to dozens of yards. The forest was rearranging itself, accessing different configurations, and I was perceiving the transitions in real time. After perhaps 30 minutes of careful navigation, I emerged into the clearing where I'd established my base camp. The transition was abrupt, one moment surrounded by dense forest, the next standing in open space beneath a sky that showed the first stars appearing in deepening twilight. My truck sat where I'd parked it, exactly as I'd left it. The GPS base station continued its steady logging, LED indicators showing normal operation. Everything appeared completely ordinary, as if the last 8 hours had been nothing more than routine survey work. But I knew better. I'd crossed boundaries that most surveyors never encounter, seen things that conventional cartography insisted couldn't exist, and committed to a course of action that would require me to challenge everything my profession assumed to be true. The base station's steady logging represented the imposition of order, the broadcast of corrections that told the surrounding space what configuration it should occupy. Every moment it operated, it was performing an act of violence, however unintentional, against the property's actual nature. I shut down the base station, disconnecting it from power and removing it from its mount. The cessation felt significant, as if I'd released pressure that had been building all day. Without the constant broadcast of differential corrections, without the insistence that space conform to predetermined coordinates, the property could return to sewer position, could resume holding multiple configurations simultaneously. I'd removed one anchor. Tomorrow, I'd retrieve the control point stakes I'd driven, eliminating the other constraints I'd imposed. I spent that night in my truck, unable to justify the drive back to town when I'd need to return at dawn. I attempted sleep, but found it elusive, my mind churning through everything I'd experienced and learned. Vreeland's journal lay on the passenger seat, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling in times and spaces that weren't quite my own. Occasionally, I'd pick it up and read sections by dome light, trying to absorb the mathematics and methodology it contained. One passage particularly struck me, written in what appeared to be the journal's final entries. I have come to understand that the surveyor's role is not to master the land, but to translate it, to create representations that allow others to comprehend what they haven't directly experienced. Traditional surveying performs this translation by simplification, reducing three-dimensional complexity to two-dimensional maps, ignoring temporal variation, suppressing anything that doesn't fit conventional models. The result is useful but dishonest, descriptive only of what we wish the land to be rather than what it is. My hope is that whoever continues this work will find ways to translate more honestly, creating representations that preserve rather than destroy the thing being represented. Dawn arrived cold and gray, with fog settling into the low areas and reducing visibility to dozens of yards. I ate a quick breakfast from my pack supplies, and then set about the work I'd committed to. The first task was retrieving the control point stakes I'd established the previous day. I'd driven 7 stakes in total before my encounter with Vreeland had redirected my understanding. Each one represented an anchor point, a coordinate that insisted space conform to specific configuration. Removing them would be a small gesture toward reversing the violence I'd begun. I started with the nearest stake, the one at the northwestern property corner, where I'd first noticed discrepancies between GPS coordinates and physical reality. Relocating it required using my compass and dead reckoning, since I'd committed to leaving the GPS equipment powered off. The navigation was slower than electronic guidance would have been, requiring constant attention to terrain features and heading. But it was also more intimate, more connected to the actual landscape rather than to the abstract space of coordinates. I found the stake after about 40 minutes of walking, its bright orange cap visible through the fog. I pulled it from the ground, noting how the steel had already begun to oxidize where it entered the soil, as if it had been in place for years rather than hours. The surrounding area showed the same wrongness I'd noticed yesterday, distances that seemed variable, trees whose positions didn't quite match my memory, an overall sense of instability that conventional space shouldn't possess. With the stake removed, I felt the space relax subtly, as if tension had been released. The fog seemed to shift more naturally, The temperature felt more appropriate for the conditions. Even the silence seemed less oppressive, though I still heard no birds or insects. The change was minor but perceptible, a small movement toward the property's natural state. I spent the morning retrieving the remaining stakes, working systematically through the locations I documented. Each retrieval required navigation through forest that seemed to shift between observations, that never quite looked the same way twice. Twice, I found myself at locations where I was certain I'd placed stakes, only to discover nothing. No stake, no sign that I'd ever been there, as if those particular measurements had been rejected by the space itself. By noon, I'd retrieved 5 of the 7 stakes and was navigating toward what should have been the 6th location, somewhere in the wetlands along the western boundary. The fog had persisted all morning, thick enough that visibility rarely exceeded 50 feet. The wetland areas were particularly challenging, with standing water that reflected the gray sky and made it difficult to judge depth. I moved carefully, testing each step, occasionally breaking through concealed soft spots to sink knee-deep in cold water and organic muck. I was extracting myself from one such soft spot when I heard voices. Human voices, multiple people speaking in tones that suggested casual conversation rather than distress or urgency. The sound came from ahead, somewhere beyond the limit of fog-reduced visibility. I froze, listening. The property was private land, posted against trespassing, and in my previous day's exploration I'd seen no evidence of recent human presence. Who would be out here, in this remote wetland, on a foggy weekday morning? I advanced cautiously, moving toward the voices. As I drew closer, I could distinguish multiple speakers, 3, perhaps 4 people, their words becoming clearer though I still couldn't make out specific phrases. They seemed to be working at something, engaged in some cooperative task that required coordination and communication. Through the fog, I caught glimpses of movement, dark shapes that might have been human figures. I emerged from a particularly dense stand of alders into a more open area and stopped, trying to process what I was seeing. 4 men worked in the shallow water, dressed in clothing that looked wrong. Not modern outdoor gear, but rather old-fashioned work clothes, wool pants and canvas jackets, heavy boots. They were surveying, I realized. Setting up equipment that I recognized as 19th century vintage. A transit on a wooden tripod. A surveyor's chain for measuring distance. Range poles painted in alternating red and white bands. One of the men looked up as I appeared, his bearded face showing no surprise at my sudden presence. "You're late," he said, his accent marking him as someone from an earlier era, his vowels shaped differently than modern speech. "Vreeland said you'd be here by mid-morning. We've already established 2 control points without you." I stood speechless, understanding that I'd somehow crossed another boundary, stepped into a different temporal state of the property. These weren't men surveying in my present. They were surveyors from the past, perhaps Vreeland's own crew, existing in a time that the property still held in sewer position alongside its contemporary state. "I'm not," I began, but the man cut me off with a wave. "No excuses. Grab a range pole and help Thompson establish the next sight line. We need to finish this section before the light fails." He gestured toward one of the other men, who was wading through shallow water with a pole held vertically, apparently searching for a specific position. I found myself complying, reaching for one of the spare poles leaning against a nearby tree. The wood was solid in my hands, the paint fresh, the metal tip gleaming. I waded out to where Thompson worked, holding the pole as he directed, moving incrementally left or right as he called adjustments. Behind us, I could hear the survey leader calling out numbers, recording measurements in the methodical way surveyors have worked for centuries. "Hold it there," Thompson said when I'd reached the position he wanted. "Steady now, keep it vertical." He was younger than the other men, his face unlined but his eyes showing the kind of focus that comes from demanding work. "You ever done this before?" he asked while we waited for the transit operator to complete his observation. "I'm a surveyor," I said, "but I work with different equipment, electronic instruments, GPS." Thompson laughed, the sound carrying oddly through the fog. "GPS, that's a good one. What's it stand for?" "God's perfect system." He seemed genuinely amused by his own joke. "Global positioning system," I replied, "using satellites to determine coordinates." "Satellites?" Thompson shook his head, still smiling. "You've got quite an imagination. Next you'll tell me you can survey without chains or transits, just point some magic device at the sky and know exactly where you stand." "That's exactly what I do," I said, realizing as I spoke that I was describing technology that wouldn't exist for another century from Thompson's perspective. The satellites broadcast signals that receivers use to calculate position, accurate to centimeters if you use differential correction. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by an expression that mixed confusion with something that might have been concern. "Are you feeling well?" he asked. "Did you hit your head coming through the alders? Because you're talking like someone who's had their sense knocked loose." Before I could respond, the survey leader called out, "Mark that position. Thompson, drive a stake at your current location." Thompson produced a wooden stake from his pack, hand-shaped, with a sharpened end and carved notations on its face, and drove it into the soft ground using a small mallet. The stake went in easily, settling until only about 6 inches remained visible above the water. "That's number 6, Thompson called back. "2 more to complete the western boundary." "2 more, the leader confirmed. "Then we move to the high ground and work north." I stood holding the range pole, watching them work with equipment and techniques that my profession had abandoned generations ago. They were establishing a control network just as I had been, imposing coordinates on this property, forcing it into compliance with their measurements. But they were doing it with the limitations of their era. No electronic instruments, no satellites, no differential correction. Just careful observations, manual calculations, and the assumption that space behaved consistently. "The land doesn't want to be measured," I said, the words emerging before I'd fully formed the thought. "Your coordinates will be wrong, not because your technique is flawed, but because this space doesn't follow normal rules. It exists in multiple configurations, and measurement just forces it temporarily into one of them." The surveying party stopped working. All 4 men turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern to what might have been anger. The leader approached through the shallow water, his boots splashing with each step. He was older than I'd initially realized, his beard more gray than dark, his face lined with years of outdoor work. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice careful and controlled in the way people speak when they suspect they're dealing with someone unstable. "Vreeland sent you, you said. I've worked with Cornelius for 5 years and he's never mentioned having an assistant." "I'm not his assistant," I said. I'm surveying this property, but in a different time, 140 years from now. The property still exists, still wrong, still resisting measurement. Vreeland spent his life trying to understand why, developing mathematics that could describe what traditional coordinates can't capture. The leader studied me for a long moment, his eyes moving from my modern clothing to my equipment to my face. "You're not well," he finally said, his tone gentler now. "The isolation affects some men this way. The property has a quality that unsettles the mind, makes people see and say strange things. Come back to camp with us. We'll get you warm, get some food in you. You'll feel better once you're away from the wetlands." "I'm telling you the truth," I insisted, though I knew how insane I sounded. "This property exists in superposition, multiple states simultaneously. Every measurement you take is collapsing it temporarily into one configuration, but the collapse never lasts. Vreeland discovered this. He spent decades trying to develop surveying methods that accommodate it rather than suppress it. I've seen his maps. I've read his journal. I've talked to him." "You've talked to Cornelius." The leader's expression shifted toward suspicion. "When?" "He's been working alone at the eastern structure for 3 days. No one's supposed to disturb him while he's processing his calculations." "Not recently," I said, realizing I needed to be more careful about temporal references. "Or maybe very recently. Or maybe it hasn't happened yet from your perspective. Time works strangely here, like space does. Past and present and future are superimposed, accessible depending on which state the property occupies at any given moment." Thompson had moved closer during this exchange, and now he spoke quietly to the leader. "Sir, maybe we should take him up. He's definitely not right. Could be hypothermia. He said he fell through soft ground earlier. Or could be something else. But standing here arguing isn't helping." The leader nodded slowly. "Right. We'll suspend operations for the day. Thompson, you and Martinez help our confused friend back to the equipment staging area. Jackson and I will retrieve the control points we've established today. We can resume tomorrow when everyone's in better condition." I wanted to protest, to insist that I was perfectly rational, and that they were the ones who didn't understand the nature of the space they were trying to survey. But I recognized the futility of argument. From their perspective, I was a disturbed individual who'd appeared out of the fog spouting impossible claims about future technology and quantum mechanics that wouldn't be formalized for decades. The kindest thing they could do was exactly what they were attempting: remove me from the field and ensure I received care. Thompson took my arm gently but firmly. "Come on then. Let's get you dried off and warmed up. Everything looks different once you're not standing in cold water." I allowed myself to be led away, though I kept looking back at the survey party as they began retrieving their equipment. The leader and Jackson were pulling up the stakes they'd driven, removing the anchors they'd imposed on this space. I wondered if they knew what they were doing, if they understood that each stake removed allowed the property to relax back toward its natural state. Or were they simply following protocol, retrieving control points at the end of a workday with the intention of reestablishing them tomorrow? Thompson and Martinez guided me through the wetlands, following a route that seemed more direct than the wandering path I'd taken to reach them. We walked in silence, the fog still thick enough that we existed in a bubble of visibility that moved with us through the gray landscape. After perhaps 20 minutes, the ground began to rise, and the standing water became less prevalent. Trees changed from wetland-adapted species to upland forest, and the fog thinned enough that I could see further than 50 feet. We emerged into a clearing that I didn't recognize, not the clearing where I'd parked my truck, but a different space perhaps half that size, containing what appeared to be a semi-permanent survey camp. A large canvas tent stood at one side, its peaked roof shedding condensation. Equipment lay scattered around the clearing: transit cases, chain storage reels, stakes bundled for transport, all the apparatus of 19th century surveying. A fire ring held the remains of a morning cooking fire, and I could smell coffee and wood smoke. "Wait here," Martinez said, gesturing toward a wooden crate near the tent. "I'll get you something warm to drink." I sat on the crate, taking the opportunity to study my surroundings more carefully. This was definitely a working survey camp, the kind of temporary installation that crews would establish when conducting extensive work far from established roads. But it was also wrong in subtle ways. The equipment appeared too new, as if it had just been unpacked from the manufacturer. The tent showed no signs of weather wear despite supposedly being in use for an extended period. Even the fire ring looked freshly constructed, its stones clean of soot accumulation. Thompson crouched near the fire, using a bellows to revive the coals. "You said you're from the future," he said conversationally, not looking at me. 140 years, that would make it. What, 2024? I was surprised he'd done the calculation so quickly. 2025, actually. I'm surveying this property in April 2025. Same work you're doing now, establishing control points for a topographical survey, though my client wants it for development. 200 houses. 200 houses. Thompson shook his head as he arranged kindling over the reviving coals. "Hard to imagine. This feels like the loneliest place in the world. Can't picture it filled with people living ordinary lives." "I don't think it can be," I said. "Not without destroying what makes it unusual. The development would require forcing the property into rigid compliance with normal space. All that measurement, all that construction would eliminate the superposition. The wrongness would be buried." The fire caught, flames beginning to work through the kindling. Thompson added larger pieces of wood, building the fire methodically. "You keep using that word, superposition. What does it mean?" I thought about how to explain quantum mechanics to someone from the 1880s. It means existing in multiple states at the same time, not being definitely one thing or another until something forces a choice. This property exists in multiple configurations simultaneously, multiple topographies, multiple arrangements of features. When you measure it, you temporarily force it into one specific configuration. But as soon as you stop measuring, it reverts to holding all configurations at once. "Like Schrodinger's cat," Thompson said, and I stared at him in shock. "How do you know about Schrodinger's cat? That thought experiment won't be proposed for another 50 years. Thompson finally looked at me, and I saw in his eyes an intelligence I'd underestimated. "Because I'm not really Thompson," he said quietly. "Or rather, I am Thompson, but I'm also the property itself, or something generated by it, manifesting in a form you can perceive and interact with. This entire scene, the survey party, the camp, the equipment, it's the property showing you its history, letting you experience what it's experienced over decades of measurement and resistance." The clearing shifted as he spoke, the fog moving in ways fog shouldn't move, forming patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random turbulence. The equipment became less substantial, more translucent, until I could see through the transit to the trees beyond. Even Thompson himself began to fade, his solid form becoming ghostly, existing and not existing in the same space. "You're not real," I said, though the statement felt inadequate. "I'm as real as anything else here," Thompson replied. "The property has been measured thousands of times over the centuries. Each measurement leaves a trace, an impression. I'm one of those traces, given temporary substance by your presence and your need to understand. The historical Thompson existed, worked this survey party, drove those stakes. But that was in a different temporal state than the one you primarily inhabit. What you're experiencing now is the property's memory of that measurement, accessed because you crossed the boundaries and became capable of perceiving multiple states. The fire, I realized, cast no heat. The smoke rose but had no smell. The entire scene was a reconstruction, a historical record being played back through mechanisms I couldn't begin to comprehend. Why? I asked. Why show me this? Because you need to understand what measurement does, Thompson said. Every survey party that's worked this land thought they were simply documenting it. But documentation and intervention aren't separate here. Each coordinate imposed, each stake driven, each measurement taken has shaped the property, forced it toward configurations it might not otherwise occupy. We, the property, want you to see the accumulation, the weight of a century and a half of surveying violence, so you can make an informed choice about whether to continue it. I thought about my plan to complete a survey using Vreeland's methods, creating maps that acknowledged multiple states rather than suppressing them. I'm trying to do something different, I said, using mathematics that accommodate uncertainty rather than eliminate it, surveying that documents without destroying. We know, Thompson said. We felt your decision last night. That's why we're showing you this, not to discourage you, but to help you understand the full context of what you're attempting. Vreeland tried for decades to develop those methods, but he was working alone, constrained by the technology and mathematics of his era. You have advantages he didn't: more sophisticated instruments, more advanced theory, and most importantly, his journal to build upon. But you'll face the same fundamental problem. How do you create measurements that don't collapse superposition? It was the central question, the one I'd been avoiding while focusing on practical methodology. Measurement, by definition, forces specific outcomes. The act of observing determines what is observed. How could I survey the property without simultaneously destroying the thing I was trying to document? Vreeland found a partial solution, Thompson continued. His extended coordinate system includes parameters that describe the measurement process itself, when it occurred, what instruments were used, what conditions applied. By making the measurement context explicit, he created coordinates that acknowledge their own limitations. A position described this way says, "This is where I am under these specific circumstances using these specific methods," rather than claiming to be absolute truth. But that still forces the property into specific configurations, I objected. Just more configurations than traditional surveying recognizes. True, Thompson acknowledged. Complete non-intervention isn't possible once you've decided to measure. But there's a difference between measuring in ways that acknowledge context and uncertainty and measuring in ways that claim absolute authority. Traditional coordinates say this is where you are, period. Vreeland's coordinates say this is where you appear to be, given these observations, though other observations might yield different results. The first denies the property's nature. The second works with it. The clearing was fading now, the tent and equipment becoming progressively more translucent. Thompson himself was barely visible, more voice than visual presence. "We've shown you what we can," he said, his words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The rest depends on your choices. Complete your survey however seems right. We'll accommodate what we can, resist what we must, and remember everything regardless." The scene dissolved entirely, leaving me sitting on a fallen log in a clearing I did recognize, the one where I'd parked my truck. The fog had lifted while I was. Wherever I'd been, An afternoon sun broke through the canopy in shafts that illuminated dust and pollen. My equipment sat exactly where I'd left it. The GPS base station still powered down, the truck undisturbed. According to my watch, it was just past 2 o'clock. I'd lost hours again, time spent in states the property held alongside its conventional present. I retrieved Vreeland's journal from the truck and spent the rest of the afternoon studying it systematically, taking notes on the methodology and mathematics. His system was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized, incorporating elements that wouldn't be formalized elsewhere until quantum mechanics and relativity theory developed decades later. He'd worked purely from empirical observation, developing theory to explain what he'd measured rather than starting with theory and looking for confirming evidence. The key innovation was his treatment of uncertainty as a fundamental property rather than a limitation to be minimized. Traditional surveying assumes that perfect measurement would yield perfect accuracy. That uncertainty exists only because our instruments and methods are imperfect. Vreeland instead proposed that uncertainty was intrinsic to space itself, that locations didn't have single definite coordinates, but rather probability distributions describing where they might be found under various conditions. To implement this approach practically required accepting that no single measurement was complete or definitive. Instead, multiple measurements under varying conditions would build up a probabilistic description of position. The resulting map wouldn't show features at specific coordinates, but rather as regions where features were likely to be found, with probabilities varying based on measurement context. It was revolutionary cartography, decades ahead of its time, and completely incompatible with the kind of survey Meridian wanted. Engineers needed definite coordinates to design infrastructure. Contractors needed exact positions to stake construction. Buyers needed clear property boundaries. A probabilistic map that said, the property corner is probably somewhere in this 10-foot radius, with 95% confidence, would be useless for all these purposes. But it would be true in ways that conventional maps couldn't achieve. It would describe the property as it actually existed rather than as we wished it to exist. And it would preserve rather than destroy the phenomenon I'd been documenting. I spent that night in town, checking into a cheap motel, and using the evening to write a detailed report of everything I'd experienced and observed. The report wasn't for Meridian. They wouldn't understand or believe anything I documented, but rather for myself, creating a record while the memories were fresh. I described the discrepancies between GPS coordinates and physical features. I documented my encounters with Vreeland and with the survey party manifestation. I attempted to articulate the quality of wrongness that pervaded the property, that sense of space not quite conforming to conventional geometry. And I sketched out a plan for completing the survey using Vreeland's methods. It would require significantly more time than 3 weeks, probably months, to gather sufficient data under varying conditions. I'd need to acquire specialized equipment for measuring the contextual parameters Vreeland's system required. Most importantly, I'd need to convince Gerald and Meridian that the extended timeline was necessary. Though I had no idea how to justify such a request without revealing information they'd interpret as evidence of incompetence or mental instability. The next morning, I drove to the Terramark Systems office to meet with Gerald. He was in early as always, coffee already going cold on his desk while he reviewed project schedules. He looked up when I entered, his expression shifting from preoccupied to concerned as he registered something in my appearance or demeanor. "David, wasn't expecting you in the office. Thought you'd be in the field all week. Everything okay with the Hillstead survey?" I closed his office door and sat down without waiting for invitation. "There are complications," I said carefully. "The property has characteristics that make conventional surveying problematic. I need to discuss alternative approaches and timeline extensions." Gerald's concern deepened. "What kind of complications?" The satellite imagery looked straightforward: forested terrain, some wetlands, nothing we haven't handled before. "The imagery is misleading," I said. "Ground conditions don't match the satellite view. There are significant spatial anomalies that affect position determination. GPS coordinates don't correlate reliably with physical features." "GPS equipment malfunction?" Gerald asked, immediately jumping to the explanation that made sense within his professional framework. "No, I've verified the equipment thoroughly. It's functioning exactly as designed. The problem is with the space itself, not with our measurement tools." Gerald leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that mixed skepticism with something that might have been worry. "David, I'm going to be direct here. You're saying the problem is with space itself. Do you hear how that sounds?" "I hear how it sounds," I acknowledged. "But I'm telling you what I've observed. The property demonstrates characteristics that suggest it doesn't follow normal spatial geometry. Attempting to survey it using conventional methods will produce results that are technically accurate according to GPS coordinates, but that don't correspond to the actual terrain." "That's impossible," Gerald said flatly. "GPS is GPS. Coordinates are coordinates. If the equipment says you're at a specific position, then that's where you are. If physical features don't match, then either the historical maps are wrong, or there's been physical change to the terrain, or there's user error in correlation. Those are the possibilities. Space doesn't follow normal geometry isn't one of them." I pulled out my field notebook and opened it to the sketches and notes I'd made. "Look at this documentation. Every control point I established showed discrepancies between GPS position and physical features. Not small errors that could be attributed to equipment limitations or map inaccuracies, but substantial mismatches that suggest the underlying space is inconsistent." Gerald examined the notes, his frown deepening as he read. "These discrepancies could be explained by poor satellite imagery georeferencing," he said, "or by using outdated base maps. Did you verify the vintage and accuracy of the satellite images you're working from?" "The images are current, from last year, and the discrepancies I'm seeing don't match patterns that would result from georeferencing errors. They're more fundamental than that." Gerald closed the notebook and slid it back across the desk. "David, I'm going to be honest with you. What you're describing sounds like stress or fatigue affecting your judgment. Working alone in isolated conditions can do that. I've seen it before in field personnel. You start seeing problems that aren't there, start questioning equipment that's working fine." "I'm not experiencing stress-related impairment," I said, though I understood how unconvincing the claim sounded given what I was reporting. "Maybe not," Gerald said, his tone gentler now. "But I think you should take a few days off anyway. Come back to the office, work on projects here where you've got support and oversight. I'll send another surveyor to complete the Hillstead County work. No reflection on you, just fresh eyes to verify conditions." This was exactly what I'd feared, being pulled from the project, having my observations dismissed as evidence of unreliability. If you send someone else, they'll encounter the same issues, I said. Then we'll deal with those issues when they arise, Gerald replied. But I suspect they'll find normal conditions and will complete the survey on schedule. Look, David, you're one of my best people. You've never given me reason to question your judgment before. But right now, you're reporting impossible conditions and requesting timeline extensions we can't afford. That's not like you. Taking some time to reset isn't a punishment. It's taking care of a valuable employee. I recognized the futility of further argument. Gerald was being reasonable within the framework of conventional cartography. He had no context for understanding what I'd observed, because he'd never encountered space that violated normal geometric rules. Trying to convince him would only reinforce his conclusion that I was experiencing impairment. All right, I said, standing. I'll take a few days, but I'd like to request that whoever continues the survey documents any anomalies carefully. If they encounter the same discrepancies I've observed, it would validate my concerns. Of course, Gerald agreed readily, clearly relieved that I wasn't fighting the decision. We always document thoroughly. And David, seriously, take care of yourself. Get some rest. See friends. Do something that's not survey work. You'll feel better. I left his office feeling the weight of having made a choice I couldn't unmake. I'd tried the conventional approach, reporting through proper channels, requesting support for alternative methodology, and been rejected as unreliable. The professional path was closed. If I wanted to complete a proper survey of the Hillstead County property, I'd have to do it independently, without authorization or institutional support. The decision meant career consequences I couldn't fully anticipate. At minimum, I'd be violating my contract with Terramark by conducting unauthorized work on a client property. Meridian could sue for trespass and interference. Gerald would fire me for insubordination and professional misconduct. My reputation in the cartography community would be destroyed once word spread about why I'd been terminated. But I thought about Vreeland, who'd spent decades working alone, developing revolutionary mathematics that no one else would recognize or value. I thought about the property itself, existing in sewer position, holding its secrets despite more than a century of surveying violence. And I thought about the 200 houses Meridian planned to build, the weight of measurement and construction that would crush whatever phenomenon the property represented. Some things were worth preserving, even at personal cost. I spent the next week preparing for independent work. I purchased equipment that Vreeland's methodology required: a high-precision magnetometer, a microbarometer capable of detecting pressure changes of less than 1 millibar, various environmental sensors. I fabricated custom survey stakes from hardwood, carving them by hand in the style Vreeland had used, creating physical markers that felt more appropriate than the mass-produced metal stakes I'd used before. And I studied his journal obsessively, working through the mathematics until I could replicate his calculations and understand the logic behind his extended coordinate system. On a Monday morning in late April, I returned to the property. I parked on the county road rather than using the access track, approaching on foot through forest that bordered the eastern boundary. This felt more honest than using the official entrance. I was trespassing now, conducting unauthorized work, operating outside all professional frameworks, walking and seemed appropriate. The forest received me without resistance, the trees standing silent in their ancient patterns. I navigated using compass and Vreeland's maps, correlating 19th century cartography with contemporary terrain. The correlation was imperfect, but I'd learned to work with imperfection, to accept that definite positions were less important than understanding the patterns of position variation. I worked for 6 weeks, returning to the property daily except when weather made it unsafe. I established a new control network using Vreeland's methodology, placing stakes only after conducting multiple observations under varying conditions. Each control point required days to document properly, measuring position at different times of day, under different weather, during different phases of the moon, which Vreeland had noted seemed to correlate with spatial variations. I filled notebooks with observations, building up the probabilistic position descriptions that Vreeland's system required. I documented correlations between environmental parameters and apparent spatial configuration, noting that magnetic field strength seemed particularly significant. Strong field conditions correlated with the property occupying configurations more similar to conventional space. Weak field conditions allowed greater deviation, more pronounced superposition effects. And I encountered the phenomena repeatedly: the temporal discontinuities, the manifestations of historical survey parties, the subtle rearrangements of terrain between observations. Each encounter I documented methodically, treating them as data points rather than impossibilities. If the property existed in quantum superposition, then observations from different temporal states were simply measurements from different configurations, all equally valid. I never saw Vreeland again, though I often felt his presence, particularly when working near the building where I'd first encountered him. The structure itself shifted between states, sometimes present and solid, other times absent or ghostly, occasionally appearing in conditions that suggested different stages of construction or decay. I photographed it in all its manifestations, creating a visual record of how a single building could exist in multiple temporal configurations. The survey progressed slowly but systematically. By mid-June, I'd established 23 control points using Vreeland's methodology, each one documented with hundreds of individual observations. The resulting data was complex beyond anything conventional surveying would produce, not simple coordinate triplets, but rather multi-dimensional probability distributions that described how position varied with measurement context. I processed the data using software I'd written specifically for this purpose, implementing Vreeland's equations in modern computational frameworks. The resulting maps were unlike any cartographic product I'd ever created. Features appeared not as definite lines, but as probability densities, regions where boundaries were most likely to be found. Elevation was shown not as specific contours, but as statistical surfaces describing the distribution of possible heights. Water courses appeared as branching probability trees, showing all the configurations the streams had occupied across different observations. The maps were beautiful in their honesty. They didn't pretend to complete knowledge or absolute accuracy. They acknowledged uncertainty as fundamental rather than something to be minimized. They described the property as it actually existed, multiple, unstable, refusing to be pinned down by coordinates. In late June, I received a registered letter from Meridian Holdings' legal department. They'd learned of my continued presence on the property, probably from the surveyor Gerald had sent, who would have noticed my stakes and equipment, and were demanding I cease trespassing immediately. The letter threatened legal action if I didn't comply, citing contract violations and interference with their development plans. I'd expected this. What surprised me was the second letter that arrived the same day, this one from Gerald. It was brief and formal, terminating my employment with Terramark Systems effective immediately due to gross professional misconduct and violation of client confidentiality. The letter concluded with a line that felt more personal than the legal language surrounding it. "I'm disappointed, David. You were better than this." I sat in my apartment reading both letters, understanding that my professional life as I'd known it had ended. No surveying company would hire me after termination for misconduct. My credentials would be questioned, possibly revoked. The years I'd spent building reputation and expertise had been rendered worthless by 6 weeks of unauthorized work. Yet I felt no regret. I'd made my choice knowing the consequences, and I'd gotten what I wanted: a complete survey of the Hillstead County property using methodology that preserved rather than destroyed its nature. The maps existed. The data was recorded. Vreeland's mathematics had been validated through practical application. Even if no one else ever saw or valued the work, it was done and it was true. I decided to make one final visit to the property, to retrieve my equipment and take a last set of observations. It was early July now, the height of summer, and the forest had transformed from spring's tentative greening to full verdant density. The canopy was so thick that ground-level light had the greenish quality of being underwater. Humidity made the air feel thick enough to drink, and insects finally provided the sounds that had been absent during my earlier visits. I approached what I'd come to think of as the primary clearing, where I'd first parked my truck back in April. The space had changed in the intervening months. Young trees had grown with impossible speed, transforming the margins. The grass had become a meadow, with wildflowers I didn't remember planting themselves in patterns that suggested intentional design rather than random distribution. And at the clearing's center, where nothing had been before, stood a structure. It was small, perhaps 10 feet square, built from weathered boards that might have been salvaged from Vreeland's building. A simple peaked roof, no windows, a door made from planks held together with hand-forged straps. The construction style was 19th century, but the wood showed varying degrees of weathering that suggested it had been assembled from materials of different ages. Some boards appeared freshly cut, others looked centuries old. I approached cautiously, noting that survey stakes surrounded the structure at precise intervals. The stakes were mine. I recognized my own carving style, but I hadn't placed them in this configuration. Someone or something had rearranged my control network, creating a geometric figure that I recognized from Vreeland's journal as having mathematical significance in his coordinate system. The door stood open. Inside, I could see what appeared to be a single room illuminated by light that came from no visible source. I stepped across the threshold and felt the now familiar sensation of crossing boundaries between states. The temperature dropped. The quality of sound changed. And when I turned to look back at the clearing, I saw it existed in multiple configurations simultaneously. Empty meadow, dense forest, survey camp, all occupying the same space in superposition that my eyes could finally perceive directly rather than through inference. Inside the structure, a table held a familiar leather-bound journal. Not Vreeland's. I still had that in my pack, but one identical to it. I opened it and found the first page covered in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. The text read, "Survey completed June 28, 2025 by David Mercer, using methodology developed by C. Vreeland and extended through practical application. This journal contains complete documentation of the Hillstead County property in its multiple states, along with theoretical framework for understanding spaces that exist in quantum superposition." I paged through the journal, finding hundreds of pages filled with data, calculations, maps, and theoretical discussion, all in my handwriting, all documenting work I'd done but couldn't remember recording in this format. It was as if some version of myself, existing in a different temporal state, had compiled everything into this comprehensive record while my conscious self had been focused on daily observations. Behind me, I heard movement. I turned to find Vreeland standing in the doorway, his form more solid than it had been during our first encounter. He looked different now, younger, less burdened, as if some weight had been lifted. "You completed it," he said, gesturing to the journal in my hands. "A full survey using the extended methodology, the first since I attempted it in 1884. And you've proven the approach works, that it's possible to map spaces like this one without destroying what makes them unusual." "I don't remember compiling this," I said, holding up the journal. "You haven't yet," Vreeland replied. "Or rather, you will, but in a temporal state you don't currently occupy. The property exists in superposition, remember. Different versions of you are conducting different aspects of the work simultaneously, though your conscious awareness can only track one version at a time. This journal is the synthesis, created by the version of you that has access to all the states at once." He stepped fully into the structure, and I saw that he was more substantial now than he'd ever been, almost completely solid. "The property has accepted your survey," he continued. "By measuring it in ways that accommodate rather than suppress its nature, you've created a kind of understanding between observer and observed. It knows now that measurement doesn't have to be violence. And in return, it's shown you things it's never shown anyone else. Its history, its multiple configurations, the patterns underlying its instability." "What happens now?" I asked. "Meridian still plans to develop it. They'll send other surveyors, ones who won't notice or care about its nature. The construction will proceed and all of this will be buried." "Perhaps," Vreeland acknowledged. "Or perhaps your work has changed things in ways that make development impossible. Space that exists in superposition doesn't accept rigid structures easily. Foundations poured at specific coordinates might find the coordinates themselves shifting. Buildings constructed in one configuration might not remain stable when the property transitions to another state. Meridian may discover that the land itself refuses to be developed, regardless of how much money they invest or how many surveyors they hire." He moved to the table, placing his hand on the journal beside the one I held. "There are 2 copies now," he said. "One for you, to keep and study and eventually share with whoever is ready to understand it. One that stays here, part of the property's own record of itself. The land remembers everything that happens to it, and your survey will be part of that memory forever." "What about you?" I asked. "Will you finally rest now that someone's continued your work?" Vreeland smiled slightly. "Rest implies I'm tired, which presupposes I experience time linearly. I exist now in all the moments I existed during life, plus all the moments since then when the property manifests my presence. I'm always working on the survey, always discovering the mathematics, always dying at my desk in November 1884. And now I'm also always meeting you, always sharing the journal, always watching you complete what I started. Whether that constitutes rest or continued labor depends on perspective." He began to fade, becoming translucent again. "The property will protect itself," he said, his voice growing distant. "It's had more than a century of practice resisting measurement and development. Your survey has given it new tools, documentation of its own nature that can be used to argue against conventional land use. Whether that's enough remains to be seen, but you've done what you could. You've created truth where others would have imposed convenience. That's all any surveyor can do. The structure faded with him, the walls becoming ghostly, the roof dissolving into mist. I stood in the clearing again, surrounded by forest in full summer growth, holding a journal that documented work I'd done but couldn't fully remember doing. The survey stakes I'd placed remained, marking out the geometric figure that described the property's underlying pattern. Everything else, the building, Vreeland, the sense of existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously, had returned to whatever condition those things occupied when not directly manifesting. I spent the rest of that day retrieving my equipment, carefully documenting each control point one final time before pulling the stakes. This felt important. Leaving the physical markers felt like continued imposition, continued insistence that the property conform to measurement. By removing them, I was releasing it back to sewer position, allowing it to return fully to its natural state. As I worked, I became aware of being watched, though I saw no one. The sensation wasn't threatening, more like the presence of interested observers who wanted to witness the dismantling of what I'd constructed. I spoke aloud as I worked, explaining what I was doing and why, talking to whoever or whatever was listening. I'm removing the stakes because measurement should be temporary. You've been generous in allowing observation, and this is my acknowledgement that the observation is complete. What you are has been documented, but you're not required to remain in measured state. Return to multiplicity. Hold all your configurations simultaneously. Resist anyone who tries to force you into conformity. By evening, I'd retrieved all 23 control points, leaving no physical evidence of my survey except the journal I carried. The property appeared as it had when I'd first seen it in April, forested, silent, characterized by that quality of wrongness that indicated space not quite following normal rules. But I sensed a difference now, a subtle relaxation, as if the land itself was relieved to no longer be under constant measurement. I hiked out to the county road as the last light faded, carrying my equipment and the two journals, Vreeland's original and the one that contained the completed survey. My truck was where I'd left it, coated in 3 months of dust and pollen but otherwise undisturbed. I loaded the equipment, secured the journals carefully in a waterproof case, and drove away without looking back. The following weeks were difficult in practical terms. Without employment and facing legal threats from both Terramark and Meridian, I had to make hard decisions about my future. I sold most of my surveying equipment to pay rent and basic expenses. I consulted lawyers who all advised settling the legal issues quickly, even if settlement meant accepting significant financial penalties. I applied for jobs in other fields, discovering that a decade of specialized surveying experience translated poorly to other types of work. But I kept the journals safe, and I kept studying them, working through the mathematics and methodology until I understood not just what Vreeland and I had done, but why it worked. The extended coordinate system represented a genuine theoretical advance, a way of describing space that acknowledged quantum effects at macroscopic scales. If such effects existed in one location, they likely existed in others, perhaps many others, waiting to be discovered by surveyors willing to look beyond conventional measurements. In August, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was elderly, female, cultured in a way that suggested East Coast education and old money. She introduced herself as Dr. Alina Vreeland Chen, great-great-granddaughter of Cornelius Vreeland, professor emerita of mathematics at a university I recognized as prestigious. She'd somehow learned about my work on the Hillstead County property and wanted to discuss it. We met at a coffee shop in the city, where Dr. Chen revealed that she'd been studying her ancestors' papers for decades, trying to understand the mathematics he'd developed and what phenomenon had driven him to such obsessive work. She'd never visited the property herself. It had passed out of family ownership generations ago. But she'd collected every scrap of documentation about Cornelius's surveying work that family archives had preserved. I knew he'd discovered something important, she said, spreading photocopies of old letters and calculations across the table between us. But I could never quite grasp what. The mathematics were ahead of their time. I've found precursors to quantum mechanics topology, even some ideas that anticipate contemporary theories in cosmology. But without context, without understanding what he was measuring and why, the equations remained abstract curiosities. I showed her the journals, both of them, and watched her face transform as she read. She worked through the calculations with a mathematician's facility, occasionally stopping to verify derivations or check assumptions. After perhaps an hour of intense focus, she looked up with an expression that mixed excitement with something like vindication. "This is revolutionary," she said quietly. "Not just for surveying, but for fundamental physics. If space can exist in macroscopic superposition the way you've documented, it changes our understanding of how quantum effects scale. The Copenhagen interpretation assumes that quantum behavior disappears at large scales due to decoherence. But this suggests there are locations where decoherence is suppressed, or where the boundary between quantum and classical behavior is more permeable. Can you help me publish it?" I asked. "Get the work peer-reviewed, validated through proper scientific channels." Dr. Chen was silent for a long moment, her expression troubled. "I want to say yes," she finally said. "This deserves publication. Cornelius deserves recognition for mathematics he developed 140 years before contemporary theory caught up. And you deserve credit for validating his approach through practical application. But publication requires making the data accessible, which means revealing the property's location. Once that happens, it becomes a site of scientific interest. Researchers will descend on it. The quantum effects you documented will be measured extensively, far more thoroughly than your survey. And based on what you've told me about how measurement affects the property." She didn't need to complete the thought. I understood the paradox we faced. Publishing the work would destroy the phenomenon we were documenting. The very act of making the discovery known would invite the kind of intensive measurement that would collapse the property's superposition permanently. We'd be trading scientific recognition for the elimination of what made the discovery significant. "There might be an alternative," Dr. Chen said slowly. "I have contacts in conservation organizations, groups that specialize in protecting unusual natural phenomena. They work quietly, acquiring land or establishing easements that prevent development without drawing public attention. If I approached them with general information, not revealing the location, but explaining that a site exists with scientifically significant characteristics that require protection, they might be willing to help. It wasn't publication or validation, but it was practical protection, and perhaps that mattered more. What would they need?" I asked. "Documentation sufficient to justify acquisition funding without revealing details that would attract unwanted attention. Probably a report describing the property's characteristics in general terms, explaining why it represents unique natural heritage worth preserving. Could you prepare something like that? I could and did. Over the following weeks, I wrote a report that described the Hillstead County property's quantum effects without providing enough specific information to allow identification. I discussed Vreeland's mathematics in theoretical terms, explaining the extended coordinate system without revealing that it had been developed specifically for this location. And I made the case for conservation based on scientific value, arguing that spaces demonstrating macroscopic quantum behavior represented natural heritage as significant as any endangered species or unique ecosystem. Dr. Chen submitted the report to her contacts, and to my surprise, they responded with genuine interest. Apparently my case wasn't unique. Several conservation organizations maintained confidential lists of locations with unusual characteristics that required protection. Some were geological curiosities. Others demonstrated biological phenomena not yet fully understood. A few involved what the organizations carefully termed spatial anomalies, locations where measurement and observation yielded consistently inconsistent results. By October, funding had been secured through a complex arrangement involving multiple conservation trusts. Meridian Holdings was approached with an offer to purchase the property at a price significantly above their acquisition cost. The offer included confidentiality agreements preventing them from disclosing details about the buyer or the reasons for purchase. After brief negotiations, probably surprised by their good fortune in finding a buyer willing to pay premium prices for undeveloped land, Meridian accepted. The property passed into the hands of a conservation trust that specialized in protecting scientifically sensitive locations. They installed minimal security, cameras at access points, sensors detecting unauthorized entry, but otherwise left it undisturbed. No trails would be cut, no facilities constructed, no interpretive signage erected. The land would simply exist, unmeasured and undeveloped, free to continue holding its multiple states in quantum superposition. Dr. Chen called me when the transaction finalized. "It's done," she said. "The property is protected in perpetuity. No development, no intensive research, no interference beyond minimal monitoring. Your survey will remain the most comprehensive documentation of its characteristics, and that documentation will be kept confidential in the Trust's archives." "Thank you," I said, inadequate words for the gratitude I felt. She'd made possible what I couldn't have accomplished alone, practical protection for something that most people would dismiss as impossible. "Thank Cornelius," she replied. "He did the hard part 140 years ago, working in isolation with crude instruments and mathematical frameworks that wouldn't be formalized for decades. You completed what he started, but he laid the foundation, and now finally his work has been validated and put to practical use. That seems like appropriate closure." After the call ended, I sat thinking about closure and whether anything associated with the property could truly close. Vreeland existed in all his moments simultaneously, forever working on his survey, forever meeting me in that building that existed in multiple temporal states. The property itself would continue transitioning between configurations, accessing all its possible topographies, resisting any attempt to pin it down to single definite state. And my own survey would remain as documentation, evidence that measurement didn't have to be violence, That observation could accommodate rather than suppress what it observed. I never returned to professional surveying. The legal settlements had left me with sufficient debt that starting over in the field felt impossible even if anyone would hire me after my termination from Terramark. Instead, I found work teaching mathematics at a community college, a position that paid poorly but provided satisfaction. I taught coordinate systems and geometric transformations, occasionally hinting to interested students that standard approaches weren't the only possibilities. That space itself might be more complex and interesting than conventional frameworks acknowledged. Dr. Chen and I remained in contact, corresponding regularly about Vreeland's mathematics and their implications. She introduced me to a small community of researchers who studied anomalous locations, physicists who'd encountered measurement inconsistencies they couldn't explain, geologists who'd found terrain that violated their models, even other surveyors who'd noticed discrepancies they'd been trained to dismiss as equipment error. We shared information carefully, always protecting the locations we discussed, always emphasizing conservation over publication. I learned that the Hillstead County property wasn't unique. Similar phenomena existed in perhaps a dozen locations worldwide, each demonstrating some degree of spatial or temporal instability. The causes varied. Some appeared to be natural features, geological or magnetic anomalies that suppressed quantum decoherence. Others seemed to have been made, deliberately or accidentally, by human activity that created conditions allowing macroscopic superposition. All resisted conventional measurement, and all required protection from the kind of intensive development that would destroy their characteristics. 6 months after the property's acquisition, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a third journal, identical in appearance to the two I already possessed, but filled with entries I'd never seen before. The handwriting cycled between Vreeland's elegant script, my own blocky printing, and other styles I didn't recognize. The entries were dated across more than a century, some from the 1840s, others from dates years in my future. They documented observations of the property in all its states, measurements taken by surveyors across generations, all contributing to an ever-growing understanding of space that refused to be pinned down. The final entry, dated October 2025, but in handwriting I didn't recognize, read, "The property remembers all who measure it, holds them in superposition alongside its own multiple configurations. Vreeland still works there, in moments that technically ended in 1884. Mercer still surveys there, in present that continues alongside past and future. Anyone who looks closely enough becomes part of the pattern, exists in all the moments they observed. This is what it means to truly see space rather than forcing it into conformity with expectations. The observer becomes observed. The measurer becomes measured. And in that mutual observation, in that exchange of measurement, lies the possibility of understanding without destruction." I read that entry multiple times, trying to decide if it was prophecy or description, warning or invitation. Eventually, I concluded it was all of these and none of them. It was simply documentation, one more observation recorded in the endless accumulation of observations that the property collected. On a November evening, exactly 1 year after beginning the Hillstead County survey, I drove out to the property one final time. I didn't enter. The Conservation Trust security would detect that, and I didn't want to raise concerns. Instead, I parked on the county road and walked to where I could see into the forest, to where the trees stood silent in their ancient patterns. I stood there in the darkness, feeling the wrongness that emanated from that space, that sense of reality not quite conforming to expectations. And I spoke aloud, knowing that some version of Vreeland would hear, that the property itself would hear, that perhaps my own future self would hear from whatever temporal state they occupied. Thank you for letting me see you. Thank you for teaching me that measurement can be accommodation rather than violence. Thank you for still being here, still holding your multiple configurations, still refusing to be pinned down by coordinates that insist you should be simple and definite. Stay strange. Stay multiple. Stay free. The forest offered no response that I could detect, but I hadn't expected one. I returned to my truck and drove away, leaving the property to its sewer position, its endless cycling through configurations that conventional cartography insisted were impossible. The journals remain with me, 3 leather-bound records of work that most surveyors would dismiss as fantasy or fraud. I study them still, working through mathematics that bridge 19th century observation and 21st century theory. And occasionally, I lecture to Dr. Chen's graduate students, showing them equations that describe space as probabilistic rather than deterministic, explaining that the grid of latitude and longitude we overlay on the world is convenience rather than truth, demonstrating that accurate measurement sometimes means accepting that accurate is not the same as precise. My name is David Mercer, and 6 months ago I believed that maps were the most honest things in the world. I know better now. Maps are interpretations, translations of complex reality into simplified representation. The most honest maps acknowledge what they cannot capture, what remains unmeasured and unmeasurable. The most honest surveyors understand that their coordinates describe not what is, but what they've forced into temporary conformity with expectations. The property still exists in its protected isolation, still transitioning between states, still holding Vreeland and me and anyone else who looked closely enough to really see it. The Conservation Trust monitors it remotely, noting occasional anomalies in their sensor data that they've learned to expect and ignore. No one enters. No one measures. No one forces it into configurations it doesn't naturally occupy. And in that freedom from measurement, in that space between coordinates, it remains itself, multiple, uncertain, impossible according to conventional physics, but undeniably real to anyone willing to see beyond the grid. That's all I ever wanted to document. That's all my survey ever attempted to describe. Some places resist being pinned down. Some spaces exist in sewer position, refusing to collapse into single definite states. And sometimes the surveyor's highest duty is not to measure but to acknowledge what cannot be measured, to document not position but the absence of definite position, to create maps that preserve mystery rather than eliminating it. The numbers lie to make themselves true, but truth is larger than numbers, deeper than coordinates, more real than the grids we impose on reality. I learned that in 600 acres of forest that existed in more configurations than I could count. I learned it from a 19th century surveyor who developed quantum mechanics before anyone knew what quantum mechanics was. I learned it by measuring space that refused to be measured, by imposing coordinates that immediately dissolved, by finally understanding that some things should remain unmapped. The Hillstead County property is still there, still wrong, still holding its secrets. And somewhere in its multiple temporal states, Vreeland still works on his survey, pen scratching across paper, recording measurements that will never quite capture what he observes. Somewhere in those same states, I still walk the forest, still drive stakes that will be pulled, still learn that measurement changes the measured in ways I can't control. We exist there always, in sewer position alongside the land we tried to map. The observer observed, the measurer measured, and in that mutual observation lies the only truth that matters. Reality is stranger and more complex than any coordinate system can describe, and acknowledging that complexity is more honest than pretending certainty we don't possess. That was 6 months ago. The wrongness persists, and I know that somewhere in the spaces between measurements, in the gaps where coordinates dissolve, it's still waiting, patient in its multiplicity, infinite in its configurations, forever refusing to be anything other than exactly what it is.